Come in from wherever you are tonight and let the day fall away for a while. Settle yourself somewhere soft. Dim the light if you like and let your eyes rest here in the almost dark, because that is exactly where tonight's story lives. I have been sitting with this one for a while now, turning it over, the way you might turn over a stone that has been lying in the same spot for centuries, and I think it is finally time to tell it to you properly. For most of human history, walking outside after the sun went down was not a small decision. It was one of the most dangerous choices a person could make. In the cities of pre-industrial Europe, night was not simply darkness. It was a kind of lawlessness that returned every single evening, regular as the tide. And anyone caught in it without a very good reason could be robbed, beaten, arrested, or worse, sometimes by criminals, and just as often by the very officers meant to keep the peace. Daylight had rules, darkness had almost none. Picture a narrow street in a European city, sometime in the middle of the 1600s. The last light has just drained out of the sky, and a young apprentice is walking home from his master's workshop later than he meant to be. He knows the rule. Everyone knows the rule. Once the curfew bell rings from the parish tower, the street belongs to no one, and staying out past that sound is itself a kind of confession. He can hear his own footsteps too clearly. He can hear somewhere behind him the scrape of another set of footsteps that were not there a moment ago. There are no lamps to see by, only the faint grey outline of rooftops against a moonless sky and doorways that could be holding anything at all. He does not run. Running, he has learned, only invites a chase. He simply walks faster, one hand pressed flat against the cold stone wall to keep his bearings, counting the turns to a home he suddenly cannot picture clearly enough. What is strange looking back is how ordinary this fear was. It was not the exception. It was simply what night meant for almost the entire span of human history before gas lamps and electricity, and it shaped daily life in ways that can be hard to imagine now, in a world where a phone in your pocket can light a room in an instant. Historians who study this era point to something you might never expect. In some cities, more violent crime was recorded happening in the space of a single dark hour than across an entire ordinary daylight afternoon. And there is another detail that tends to surprise people even more. The very men hired to keep the streets safe after dark, the night watch, were very often feared just as much as the criminals they were meant to be guarding against, sometimes for very good reason. It raises a quiet question worth sitting with. What does it do to a society generation after generation to know that safety simply ends when the sun does? Before we go any further into this, I want to pause for just a moment. If this is the kind of history you have been looking for, the kind that takes its time and tells you the truth, gently, it would mean a great deal if you took a second to follow along and leave a like somewhere on your way through tonight. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what drew you to a story about the dark. I read every one, and I love knowing who is out there with me at this hour. For now, though, just get comfortable and let's step back a little further into the world that young apprentice actually lived in. To understand why one dark street could feel so dangerous, it helps to understand just how dark that darkness truly was. We live now inside a soft orange haze of street lights and screens and porch lamps, a glow so constant that most people alive today have never once stood beneath a sky that was completely uninterrupted black. But that was simply Tuesday for most of human history. Once the sun dropped below the horizon, and once the household fire had burned down to embers, there was nothing standing between a person and true darkness, except a single candle, if they could afford one, or a torch soaked in pitch which burned fast and dangerous and never lasted the whole walk home. Moonlight helped on the nights the moon chose to show itself. On the nights it did not, a person could genuinely lose their way 3 houses from their own front door. Wealthier travellers found their own answer to that problem, and it created an entire small trade of its own. In cities across Europe, boys and young men made a living hiring themselves out as human streetlights, walking ahead of a client with a burning torch held high, guiding them home through streets they otherwise could not have crossed safely. It was dangerous, poorly paid work, and it says something about the value of even a single flame that people were willing to pay strangers to carry one through the dark on their behalf. Those who could not afford the fee simply took their chances, and many of them did not travel alone if they could help it. Groups formed at doorways and tavern exits almost automatically once the light began to fail, not out of friendship, but out of a shared unspoken understanding that a person alone after dark was a person at risk. Into that darkness, entire cities simply closed. Gates were bolted, shop shutters were nailed or barred, fires were banked down under a metal cover, a practice so common across Europe that the very word for the tool used to smother the flames, the curfew eventually came to mean the entire nightly ritual of shutting a city down. Anyone still outside once that ritual had run its course was by definition suspicious, not guilty of anything in particular, simply suspicious by virtue of being a shape moving through a place where no honest shape was supposed to be moving anymore. And it was not only other people that made the darkness dangerous. In the countryside beyond the city walls, wolves still moved through much of Europe well into recent centuries, and stories of livestock and occasionally travellers lost to them after dark were not folklore invented to frighten children. They were recorded, investigated, sometimes even paid out as compensation in official parish accounts. Closer to town, open pits, unfinished building sites, and unmarked wells waited in the exact places a tired traveller's foot might land. Death by darkness did not always require a villain. Sometimes the night itself was villain enough. The law itself seemed to agree. In many towns, simply being found outside after the curfew bell with no clear reason and no light in hand was treated as evidence enough to justify arrest regardless of what a person had actually done. Carrying a weapon after dark, which under daylight might have marked someone as a criminal, was in many places expected, even encouraged, because the alternative was walking home defenseless. Homeowners kept dogs by the door specifically for the hours after sunset, and it was common in more than one European city for households to keep a lit candle in a front window through the night, not for decoration, but as a small, quiet signal that someone inside was still watching. None of this fully worked. All of it mattered anyway, because it shaped how an entire civilization organized its evenings, its architecture, and its unspoken rules about who was allowed to be seen and where once the light went out. And this was not a passing phase confined to one century or one troubled decade. It stretched on largely unchanged in its basic shape for hundreds of years across nearly every corner of Europe and much of the wider world long before the grandparents of anyone alive today were born. Kings changed, wars ended and began again. Whole empires rose and fell, and through all of it the fear of the night stayed remarkably constant generation after generation, stubbornly outlasting nearly everything else it touched. What makes this history worth returning to generation after generation is not simply the danger itself, but what people built in response to it. Across different centuries and different cities, ordinary communities found their own ways of pushing back against the dark, some clever, some brutal, some almost accidental, and each solution reshaped the rhythm of daily life for everyone who lived inside it. Scholars still debate exactly how much of the fear surrounding nighttime crime was justified by real danger, and how much was amplified by rumor, superstition, and the simple universal human unease of not being able to see. What the surviving records do make clear is that the fear itself was powerful enough to organize entire societies around it long before anyone thought to challenge the darkness directly. That challenge, when it finally came, did not arrive all at once. It arrived as slowly one flickering lantern, and one uneasy compromise at a time across centuries of trial failure and quiet, stubborn effort. To understand how that happened and what it cost the people who lived through it, We have to go back further still to the very first attempts anyone made to hold darkness at bay, to really understand the world that Apprentice was hurrying through. It helps to step back even further than one street, one city, or one century. For nearly the entire span of human civilization, the sun did not simply light the day. It governed it completely in a way that is almost impossible for a modern person to feel in their bones. There was no negotiating with sunset. There was no flicking a switch to argue with it. When the light went, the world that depended on it went with it, and every single person from a monarch in a stone palace to a farmer in a mud-walled cottage lived inside that same unbreakable arrangement. Meals were built around it. Work was built around it. Even prayer was built around it in the older Christian tradition of marking the day by canonical hours, bells calling people to worship at set points as the sun climbed and fell, so that the rhythm of devotion itself was really the rhythm of daylight dressed in ritual. Markets opened at first light and closed well before dusk, not out of habit, but out of necessity, because conducting business by touch and guesswork was neither safe nor practical. Farmers rose with the earliest grey of morning and stopped when the fields simply became unreadable underfoot. An entire civilization across many centuries and many nations quietly organized its labor, its worship, its meals, and its movement around a star it could not control and could not extend even for a single extra hour. What complicates this picture and makes it more interesting than a simple story of darkness and fear is that access to light itself was never equal. A wealthy household could afford beeswax candles which burned clean, bright, and relatively long, along with enough of them to hold back the dark for hours after sunset if the family wished. A poorer household almost certainly could not. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat were the more common alternative, and they were cheaper for a reason. They smoked. They smelled faintly of the slaughterhouse. They guttered and spat and needed constant trimming, and even then they offered only a small, dim, unreliable circle of light that barely reached beyond an arm's length. For most families across most of history, once true darkness fell. The honest answer to what came next was simply nothing. The household stopped. People sat close together in near total blackness. Or they went to bed, because bed was warm and free and the only sensible answer to a world that had just gone dark around them. Oil offered a third option somewhere between the two, and it too came with its own hierarchy. Olive oil, where it was available, burned relatively cleanly, but it was expensive and often reserved for the wealthy or for religious use inside churches where a small oil lamp might be kept burning through the night as a symbol, as much as a practical light source. Fish oil and other cheaper animal oils served the same purpose for households that could not afford olive oil, though the smell that came with them was by most surviving accounts considerably less pleasant. Whatever the source, the underlying pattern held steady across nearly every region and every century of this era. Light, real, usable, light after the sun went down was not a given. It was a resource rationed by the wealth, and the poorer a household was, the more completely darkness simply swallowed their evenings whole. This single fact, more than any other, may be the real key to understanding the fear that surrounded nighttime for so long. Darkness did not just remove light, it removed almost all activity or visibility and nearly all of the ordinary social structure that made daylight feel safe, and into that emptiness across nearly every culture that has left behind written or oral tradition, something remarkably consistent took root. Darkness itself became morally loaded. It was not simply the absence of sun, it became in the imagination of ordinary people the natural home of everything, daylight kept in check. Thieves belong to the night, spirits belong to the night. Sin, temptation, and disorder of every kind were imagined as creatures most comfortable once the light was gone, and church sermons across medieval and early modern Europe returned again and again to this same association, warning listeners that the hours after dark were spiritually as well as physically dangerous ground. There is a detail buried inside this history that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it, and it has nothing to do with crime or superstition at all. It concerns sleep itself. What survives in diaries, court records, and medical texts from before the era of artificial lighting suggests that many people across pre-industrial Europe did not sleep the way most of us do now, in one unbroken stretch through the night. Instead, they appear to have slept in two distinct phases, a first sleep beginning not long after dark, followed by an hour or more of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, and then a second sleep carrying them through until morning. During that waking hour, people are recorded praying, talking quietly with a spouse tending a low fire, or simply lying still in the dark with their thoughts. Historians who study this pattern still debate exactly how universal it was, and whether it reflects a true biological rhythm, or simply the practical reality of long, undifferentiated nights with nothing else to do inside them. But the fact remains striking either way. For a very long stretch of human history, the middle of the night was not simply feared, it was also quietly lived in. There is a deeper cause worth sitting with here, one that goes beyond simple superstition. Fear of the dark, in a purely practical sense, kept people alive. A household that treated darkness as dangerous was a household less likely to wander into a wolf's path, less likely to fall into an unmarked well, less likely to cross paths with an actual criminal who genuinely was using the cover of night to hunt for victims. Centuries of caution passed down as folk warning and religious teaching alike functioned as a kind of inherited survival instinct, even when any single warning sounded on its surface like pure superstition. The fear was not irrational. It was in a very real sense earned generation after generation by real losses that were never fully forgotten. Children absorbed this atmosphere long before they understood any of the reasoning behind it. Cross-surviving folk tales, lullabies, and moral instruction from this era, darkness is treated again and again as something to be respected, even revered, rather than simply avoided. Parents told their children not to wander past the edge of the firelight, not because of any single specific threat, but because the boundary between light and dark had become culturally the boundary between safety and everything unknown. That lesson, repeated at bedtime across countless generations in countless languages, helped ensure the fear of night was never simply a private feeling. It was taught deliberately and consistently as a form of practical wisdom passed from one generation to the next. Not everyone experienced that darkness in the same way, and this is where the human cost of this history becomes sharper and more personal. For women in particular, the hours after sunset carried a different additional weight. Moving through a dark street alone at almost any point across pre-industrial Europe was not simply dangerous in the general sense that applied to everyone. It carried a specific social risk as well, because a woman seen outside unaccompanied after dark could find her reputation questioned regardless of her actual reason for being there. Entire households structured their evenings around this reality, arranging for servants, husbands, or older sons to escort women home from any errand that ran late, not necessarily because a specific threat was expected, but because darkness itself was treated as a kind of accusation waiting to happen. The danger of the night, in other words, was never purely physical. It was woven into reputation, into social standing, into the quiet architecture of who was allowed to move freely through the world and who was not. Beyond the cities and their bells and their bolted gates, the countryside carried its own version of this same total darkness, arguably an even more complete one. A traveller moving between villages after sunset had no curfew bell to guide them, no watchman's lantern bobbing somewhere ahead, and often no clear road at all. Once the light failed, only a worn track that could vanish into field or forest without warning. Distances that felt manageable in daylight became genuinely disorienting once darkness closed in, and travellers who could not reach an inn or a farmhouse before nightfall sometimes had little choice but to wait out the hours until dawn wherever they happened to be standing huddled against a tree line or a stone wall, listening to a landscape they could no longer see. It is worth pausing on just how strange that would feel to modern ears. An entire continent, crisscrossed by roads that simply stopped functioning every single night for almost the whole of human history. The evidence for how travellers actually coped with this varies considerably from region to region, and the picture is not yet complete. Some parish records describe informal networks of farmhouses that would leave a door unbolted or a lantern hung outside specifically for stranded travellers passing through after dark, a quiet tradition of hospitality built directly out of necessity. Other accounts describe far less generous arrangements, where a traveller caught wandering a rural estate after nightfall might be treated with open suspicion, occasionally even violence, on the assumption that no one with honest business would still be moving after the light had gone. Both realities likely existed side by side, shaped by local custom, local danger, and the simple unpredictability of who a stranger in the dark might actually turn out to be. And yet inside all of this, something else was quietly taking shape. People are, if nothing else, remarkably persistent, and a species that had spent countless generations rearranging its entire existence around the absence of light was never going to leave that arrangement unchallenged forever. Small scattered attempts to push back against the dark had already begun appearing here and there, tentative and imperfect long before anyone imagined a street lit from end to end. Those early efforts, and the very particular kind of stubbornness it took to make them work, are where this story turns next. Somewhere in the long dark centuries, this story has already walked through a very old and very human idea begins to take shape. If darkness cannot be defeated, perhaps it can at least be managed. Perhaps someone or some system could stand between the ordinary sleeping household and everything that moved through the night outside its walls. That idea, modest as it sounds, would eventually reshape the physical layout of towns, the daily obligations of ordinary citizens, and the very sound of the evening itself, one bell, one bolted gate, one patrol at a time. The earliest attempts were not glamorous. They were blunt, practical, and often deeply unfair, and they grew less out of grand civic planning than out of sheer necessity. In parts of early medieval England, communities were organised into small mutual groups, often around 10 households bound together under a shared legal responsibility for one another's conduct. If trouble happened after dark within that group, every member of it could be held accountable, whether they had any actual part in the trouble or not. It was a crude system built less on catching wrongdoers after the fact and more on making an entire neighbourhood personally invested in keeping each other quiet, honest, and indoors once the light went down. Fear of collective punishment turns out to be a remarkably effective tool for encouraging people to lock their own doors early. The curfew bell itself, that single sound already threaded through this story, carries a history stranger than most people realise. The word survives in English almost unchanged from its origin in Old French, where it literally meant cover the fire, a nightly instruction to smother the household hearth, so no stray ember could catch a home ablaze while its occupants slept. Popular tradition repeated for generations credits William the Conqueror with formally imposing this practice across England in the decades following the Norman conquest, ringing a bell each evening as a signal for every fire to be banked and every household to fall silent. Historians today are considerably more cautious about that specific story. The evidence remains incomplete, and some researchers argue the curfew bell may have existed in various local forms well before any single king ordered it, arising naturally out of the same basic fire safety concerns in towns built almost entirely of timber and thatch, where a single unwatched flame could level an entire street by morning. What is not in dispute is the eventual result. Across England and in similar forms across much of continental Europe, The sound of a bell at dusk became the daily punctuation mark between the world of daylight and the world of night, understood by everyone within earshot to carry the force of both practical caution and unspoken law. Formal responsibility for watching the night did not stay scattered and informal forever. By the late 1200s, English law had begun to codify what earlier custom had only suggested. A royal statute issued in the final years of that century required walled towns to maintain an organised watch through the warmer months of the year, specifically because longer daylight hours meant longer evenings, and longer evenings meant more opportunity for exactly the kind of trouble everyone already feared. Gates were to be shut at sunset and guarded until sunrise. Men of the town chosen in rotation were required to patrol the streets through the night, armed, alert, and legally obligated to raise an alarm the moment they encountered anything suspicious. That alarm had a name of its own, the hue and cry, and it carried a weight modern readers might not expect. Once raised, it was not simply a warning, it was a legal summons. Every able-bodied person within earshot who heard it was obligated under law to drop whatever they were doing and join the pursuit of whoever or whatever had triggered it. Refusing to join a hue and cry once it reached your ears was itself a punishable offence in many jurisdictions, which meant an entire street in theory could be transformed in a matter of seconds from a row of sleeping households into a small, improvised posse spilling out into the dark in nightclothes carrying whatever tool came first to hand. Paris developed its own parallel version of the same idea, and it arrived earlier than many people assume, as far back as the middle of the 1200s under the reign of a king remembered by history as a particularly devout and orderly ruler. A formal mounted patrol was established specifically to move through the city after dark, answering directly to royal authority rather than to any single neighbourhood or guild. Over the following centuries, this evolved into a layered system. A smaller mounted royal patrol working alongside a much larger body of ordinary citizens obligated, much like their counterparts in England, to serve rotating shifts, walking the streets through the night armed with little more than a lantern, a bell, and a long wooden staff. Here is where the story gathers one of its quieter, more human contradictions, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. This entire system, built explicitly to protect ordinary people from the dangers of the night, was staffed almost entirely by ordinary people who did not particularly want to be there. Serving on the watch was a civic obligation, not a chosen career, and in both England and France, those with enough money could often pay a fee to avoid the duty altogether, hiring a substitute to stand in their place. The result across generation after generation was a watch disproportionately made up of exactly the people least equipped to face genuine danger. Older men, poorer men, men without the money or standing to buy their way out of a long, cold, frightening night walking streets that everyone else had been taught since childhood to fear. It is a strange thing to realize turning this history over slowly. The very institution built to make the night safer was quite often staffed by the people a society considered most expendable if something actually went wrong. The equipment carried by these early watchmen deserves its own attention because it reveals just how modest this entire system really was, even as it grew more formal on paper. A typical watchman of the later medieval centuries carried a lantern, usually a simple frame of thin horn panes surrounding a single candle, since glass remained too expensive and too fragile for a tool meant to be carried through rough streets night after night. He carried a bell or sometimes a wooden rattle to announce his presence and, just as importantly, to warn anyone with genuinely dishonest intentions that the watch was close enough to hear. And he carried a long wooden staff, sometimes tipped with iron, a weapon substantial enough to look intimidating in poor light without requiring the kind of training or expense that a sword or firearm would have demanded. None of this made a single watchman particularly formidable against a determined attacker. What it did provide, walking alone or in a small pair through a silent street, was just enough presence just enough noise and visible authority to shift the odds slightly in favor of the ordinary sleeping household behind each darkened door. Not every town organized its watch in exactly the same way, and the differences between them reveal something about how each community understood its own particular version of nighttime danger. Port towns with their taverns, transient sailors, and constant flow of strangers passing through tended to station additional watchmen near the docks and waterfront streets, specifically treating that stretch of the town as a distinct zone of heightened risk. Towns built around a major market or fair, by contrast, often expanded their watch dramatically during the specific weeks the market was in session, when the ordinary population of the town might temporarily double or triple with visiting merchants and their goods. The underlying principle, though, stayed remarkably consistent from one town to the next. Danger was never assumed to be evenly spread across the night. It clustered predictably around wherever strangers' money and darkness happened to overlap. None of this means the watch accomplished nothing. Far from it. Even an imperfect patrol walking slowly through darkened streets with a lantern swinging and a bell occasionally ringing to announce the hour changed the basic calculation for anyone considering trouble after dark. A would-be thief operating in true unwatched silence faces very different odds than one who might at any moment hear footsteps and a bell rounding the corner. Scholars who study crime records from this era still debate exactly how much of a deterrent these early watches truly represented, since so much of their value lay in simply being present and visible rather than in any dramatic act of heroism, and the surviving evidence for actual arrests made by watchmen is thinner and more scattered than a modern reader might expect. What the record does show clearly is a slow, steady civic investment in the idea itself, town after town, decade after decade, each one deciding that an imperfect watch was still meaningfully better than no watch at all. There is a particular sound worth pausing on here, because it survived in altered form long after the original need for it had faded. In towns across England, the night watchman traditionally called out the hour as he walked his route, often adding a short formulaic phrase about the weather or the safety of the streets, a kind of spoken lullaby delivered to an entire sleeping town at once. 12 o'clock and all is well, the phrase or some close relative of it, echoed through darkened streets for centuries, repeated by men whose names have almost entirely vanished from history, and yet whose single reassuring sentence somehow survived into modern memory, quoted still in books and films long after the last actual watchman had retired his lantern. It is a small detail easy to overlook, but it says something quietly moving about what people actually wanted from this entire elaborate system. Not necessarily rescue, not necessarily heroics. Simply a voice in the dark confirming that someone, however imperfect, was still awake and watching on their behalf. By the later medieval centuries, this patchwork of bells, gates, rotating duty and civic obligation had hardened into something closer to a recognizable institution present in one form or another across nearly every walled town of any real size in Western Europe. It was still deeply flawed, it was still staffed largely by people who resented the duty, armed with tools barely adequate to the danger they were meant to face. But it represented something new in this long story all the same. The first real organized collective refusal to simply accept the night as ungovernable territory. Ordinary people, town after town, generation after generation, had decided that darkness was at least worth trying to hold back even imperfectly, even at real personal cost. What none of them could have fully predicted was how that fragile system would be tested once real pressure arrived. A watch built to handle the ordinary familiar shape of nighttime danger is a very different thing from a watch suddenly facing something larger, stranger, or more organized than anyone had planned for. That test, when it came, would reveal exactly how much this quiet, imperfect arrangement could actually withstand. By the time this patchwork system had settled into something like a routine, an entirely different question began to matter. Not simply whether a town could organize some version of a night watch, but how far that control could actually be pushed. And in certain cities across certain stretches of history, the answer turns out to be remarkable. Some places did not merely watch the night. They attempted with real and sustained effort to seal it shut entirely. Picture one of these cities at the height of its nightly discipline, a walled trading town of the kind that dotted much of Central Europe in the later medieval and early modern centuries. As dusk approaches, the gates, sometimes numbered in the dozens for a large city, begin closing one by one, each overseen by a dedicated gatekeeper whose entire livelihood depends on knowing exactly who belongs inside the walls and who does not. Drawbridges lift, portcullises drop. Anyone still outside when the final gate swings shut is simply outside until morning, regardless of how urgent their business, how far they have travelled, or how cold the night turns. There is no appeal to this. The wall does not negotiate. Inside those walls, the control did not stop at the gates. Many cities required anyone abroad after the curfew bell to carry and be able to produce on demand a light of their own, along with the legitimate reason for being outside at all. Being caught without both was often treated on its own as sufficient grounds for arrest, no further evidence required. In parts of Germany and Italy during the more tightly governed centuries of urban life, watchmen and city guards were empowered to stop, question and detain almost anyone found wandering after dark, and the burden of proof fell entirely on the person stopped, not on the official doing the stopping. There is a detail here that tends to surprise people, because it reveals something about how these systems actually worked in practice, and it has almost nothing to do with brute force. Long before any city organised true public lighting, many towns experimented instead with something far simpler and considerably cheaper: a legal requirement that ordinary households hang a lit lantern outside their own front door on specified dark evenings. One of the clearest surviving examples comes from London in the early 1400s, where a civic ordinance issued by the mayor required residents along major streets to display a lantern each night through the darkest winter months, stretching from the end of autumn through the beginning of February. It was not full street lighting in any modern sense. It was something more modest and more communal, an entire population conscripted household by household into holding back the darkness collectively, one small flame at a time, because no single authority could yet afford to do it for them. The city of Nuremberg offers one of the more thoroughly documented examples of exactly how far this discipline could extend. Surrounded by a substantial defensive wall, punctuated with numerous gates and towers, the city maintained a closing ritual precise enough that residents could apparently set their evening routines by it. Trumpeters stationed on the towers would sound a warning as dusk approached, giving anyone still outside the walls a final chance to hurry through before the gates swung shut for the night. Latecomers who missed that window faced a genuinely uncomfortable choice: spending the night outside the walls entirely exposed to whatever the surrounding countryside held, or seeking shelter at one of the small inns that inevitably clustered just beyond city limits, catering specifically to travellers who had misjudged the hour. The gatekeepers themselves held a position of surprising civic importance, trusted with keys to the literal boundary between the ordered world of the city and everything the darkness beyond it might contain. There is a further wrinkle in stories like this one, and it goes to the heart of how imperfectly even the most disciplined system could function. Wealthy travellers, merchants, and anyone with sufficient standing or connections often found ways around a locked gate that an ordinary traveller simply could not access. A sufficiently important visitor arriving just after closing might be able to rouse a gatekeeper and negotiate a late entry, sometimes for a fee, sometimes through a letter of introduction, sometimes simply through the unmistakable authority of fine clothing and a confident manner. The wall in theory made no exceptions. In practice, like almost every human system before or since, it bent quietly and predictably around wealth and status, even as it held firm against everyone without either. This detail matters because it reveals something the more dramatic story of gates and patrols tends to obscure. Real control over the night at its height was never purely a matter of force. It depended just as heavily on ordinary citizens accepting, sometimes resentfully, sometimes without much choice at all, a whole set of small nightly obligations. Cover your fire, hang your lantern, carry your light, know your watchword. Each demand was small on its own. Together, layered across an entire population, they amounted to something close to total supervision of how, when, and whether a person could exist outdoors once the sun went down. That watchword deserves its own attention because it represents one of the more genuinely surprising features of this era of tight nighttime control. In many walled towns, particularly during periods of political tension, war, or plague, anyone moving through the streets after dark might be challenged directly by a patrol demanding a specific password, changed regularly, known only to those with legitimate reason to be out. Failure to answer correctly could mean immediate arrest, and in the more anxious periods of certain conflicts, considerably worse. This was not simply crime prevention. It was something closer to a small nightly military exercise repeated in ordinary civilian streets week after week by butchers and bakers and merchants taking their rotating turn on watch duty, suddenly responsible for deciding in the dark whether a stranger's answer sounded honest enough to let pass. The words themselves were often changed with real deliberateness, sometimes distributed only to trusted household heads at the start of an evening, precisely because a password known too widely or held too long stopped protecting anyone at all. A baker who had spent his entire day surrounded by flour and ovens might find himself only hours later standing at a dark crossroads with a borrowed pike weighing a stranger's hesitant answer against everything he'd been told to fear. With no one else nearby to consult and no real training beyond whatever the previous year's watchman had managed to pass along. The punishments waiting for anyone caught violating this careful architecture of control varied considerably depending on the city, the century, and the specific circumstances of the offence. But they were rarely gentle. A first offence might mean nothing more than a night spent in a holding cell, and a fine come morning an unpleasant but survivable inconvenience. Repeated offences or an inability to pay the fine could escalate quickly toward the stocks, public humiliation displayed at the very heart of the town square where the offender's neighbours could see exactly who had failed to respect the boundary between day and night. In periods of particular civic anxiety, whether from war plague or political unrest, the penalties climbed further still and simply being found abroad after curfew, with no satisfactory explanation, could be treated as evidence of intent to commit some greater crime, regardless of whether any such crime had actually occurred. The night in these moments did not merely make a person vulnerable to suspicion. It made mere presence within it a kind of accusation that the accused was rarely given much opportunity to answer. It is worth pausing here to ask a quiet question, the kind worth turning over rather than rushing past. What does it actually mean for a society to build this much structure around a single recurring fear? The scale of it considered all at once is genuinely striking. Gates closing on schedule across an entire city. Lanterns required by law, passwords guarded like military secrets, an entire civilian population deputized in rotation to police their own neighbors through the night. All of it constructed brick by brick and ordnance by ordnance in response to darkness itself, treated not as a passive absence of light but as an active force requiring constant organized resistance. And there is a deeper layer beneath all of this control worth naming honestly, because it complicates the story in an interesting way. This machinery built in the name of public safety also served another purpose entirely, one that had very little to do with protecting ordinary households from thieves or wolves. A city that could monitor every gate, demand a password from every stranger, and require every household to declare its presence with a lantern, was also a city extraordinarily well equipped to monitor its own population, to track movement, to make organized descent or secret gathering considerably harder to arrange. Historians who study the political history of these urban watch systems still debate how deliberately this dual purpose was designed from the outset, and how much of it simply emerged as a convenient side effect of infrastructure built for other reasons. What the record does show clearly is that more than one ruling authority across more than one European city came to rely on the machinery of nighttime control as a tool of political order, just as much as a tool of public safety, long after the original fear of common criminals had inspired its creation. None of this fell evenly across the population, and this is where the human weight of the story lands hardest. The households wealthy enough to own their own lanterns, hire their own escorts, and simply choose to stay indoors after dark faced this entire apparatus as a mild inconvenience at worst. For the working poor, the story looked very different. Servants finishing late shifts in a wealthy household, labourers walking home after a long day at a dock or a mill, midwives summoned in the middle of the night to attend a difficult birth, all of them were forced to move through exactly the hours this system treated, with the deepest suspicion, often without the money for a proper lantern or the standing to talk their way past a sceptical watchman. A midwife's urgent errand and a thief's opportunistic prowling could, in the dim, uncertain light of a single lantern, look disturbingly similar to an exhausted, underpaid watchman deciding in a hurry who deserved to pass. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine this entire system as purely oppressive, purely a machine for control and suspicion. For many ordinary residents, living inside a heavily watched, heavily gated city also meant living inside a genuine, if imperfect, promise of shared protection, knowing that gates were locked, that a password stood between your street and any wandering stranger, that a lantern glowed in nearly every window along your route home, offered something real, a kind of collective reassurance that darkness, however feared, was at least being actively resisted by an entire community working however clumsily in concert. That reassurance mattered enormously to people who had grown up hearing and believing that the night belonged to no one in particular. What this height of control could not do, no matter how thorough it became on paper, was eliminate the underlying problem it was built to solve. Determined criminals adapted. Corrupt officials found ways to profit from the very system meant to stop them, and the sheer scale of enforcing total nighttime order across a growing, changing city eventually began to strain against its own limits in ways that no ordinance, however strict, could fully anticipate. The cracks, when they appeared, would not come from some dramatic single event. They would come quietly and gradually from the accumulated weight of a system asked to do more than any collection of bells, gates, and lanterns could realistically sustain. Every system built on human effort eventually meets the limits of the humans asked to run it, and the night watch, for all its bells and lanterns and carefully worded ordinances, was no exception. Cracks do not usually appear all at once in a story like this one. They appear slowly in small, almost forgettable moments, until one day the whole arrangement looks considerably less solid than it once did. Part of the trouble was simply mathematical. As towns grew into genuine cities swelling with new arrivals drawn by trade industry and the promise of work, the old rotating system of civic duty built for a much smaller population began to buckle under sheer scale. A neighborhood watch designed for a few hundred familiar faces does not translate easily to a sprawling city of tens of thousands, most of them strangers to one another by simple necessity. Recognizing a genuine threat becomes far harder when nearly everyone on the street, day or night, is someone you have never met before. The watch had been built on a foundation of familiarity, and that foundation was quietly eroding beneath it, city by growing city, faster than any ordinance could keep pace. The physical geography of these expanding cities made the problem considerably worse. New neighborhoods thrown up quickly to house the flood of arrivals seeking work in growing industries often developed with narrow, twisting streets and minimal planning. The kind of dense, maze-like layout that made an already difficult patrol route nearly impossible to walk thoroughly in a single night shift. A single watchman or even a small pair walking together might be responsible for a stretch of city that would have seemed absurd to their counterparts a century earlier when towns were smaller, streets were straighter, and every alley was at least somewhat familiar. Criminals, meanwhile, learn these same tangled streets with considerably more attention and considerably greater motivation than any exhausted, underpaid watchman ever could, since knowing exactly which alley offered an escape route and which dead end to avoid was for them a matter of direct personal survival rather than simple civic duty. There is also a less flattering truth buried in the historical record, one worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. By the 1700s, particularly in a rapidly expanding London, the men actually serving on the night watch had in many cases become a source of open public ridicule rather than reassurance. Wages for the position remained low, the hours were miserable, and the work attracted more often than not older men with few other options rather than able-bodied citizens, genuinely equipped to face danger. These watchmen earned a nickname that survives in the language even today, remembered as Charlies. Though historians remain genuinely divided over exactly where that nickname originated, some trace it back to reforms enacted under a 17th century king who shared that name. Others argue it emerged simply as an affectionate, faintly mocking term for any elderly, harmless figure, applied to watchmen the way a modern crowd might apply a gentle nickname to someone easy to underestimate. The evidence remains incomplete, and the true origin may never be settled with certainty. What is not in doubt is how these men were treated by a certain segment of the population who had ironically the least to fear from the dark. Young men from wealthy families, restless and often drunk, developed a genuinely disturbing pastime during parts of the 1700s, roaming the streets after dark specifically to torment the very watchmen meant to be protecting the city. One particularly notorious example involved simply overturning a watchman's sentry box while he sat inside it, trapping the elderly occupant beneath his own shelter, as younger aristocrats laughed and ran into the darkness. Reports from this era describe gangs of young men sometimes calling themselves by dramatic self-invented names, borrowed loosely from stories of distant, exoticized warriors terrorizing entire neighborhoods for a single night of entertainment, slashing at strangers with swords, assaulting watchmen, and vanishing into the dark before any real consequence could catch up with them. Newspapers of the period seized on these stories with obvious relish, and modern historians studying the same events urge real caution, noting that contemporary press accounts likely exaggerated both the frequency and the coordination of these attacks considerably beyond what actually occurred. Even accounting for that exaggeration, though, enough documented incidents survive to make clear that the watch in its weakened later form had become something closer to a target than a deterrent for at least one dangerous slice of the population it was meant to police. Corruption crept into the system from other directions as well, quieter and considerably more damaging than any single night of aristocratic mischief. A watchman earning barely enough to live on faced constant practical temptation from the very establishments he was meant to be monitoring. Tavern keepers running past the legal closing hour found it simple enough to slip a coin to a passing watchman in exchange for a few extra hours of trade unrecorded and unremarked upon. Brothel operators, gambling houses, and smugglers moving stolen or untaxed goods through darkened streets all discovered the same basic truth that an underpaid man given real authority over an entire stretch of dark, empty street was often willing to look the other way for a price considerably smaller than what his silence was actually worth to the people paying it. The watch, built originally to stand between ordinary households and the dangers of the night, had in places become something closer to a toll booth, collecting quiet payment from exactly the activities it was supposed to be preventing. Certain professions, meanwhile, grew almost entirely out of this same widening gap between official promise and practical reality. Criminal networks operating specifically after dark became increasingly organized during this period, developing their own internal codes, their own informal territories, and in some documented cases their own working relationships with corrupt officials who found it more profitable to tolerate a predictable criminal operation than to actually dismantle it. Fences who purchased stolen goods often did their business exclusively after dark, when a hurried transaction in a doorway or alley drew far less attention than the same exchange conducted in daylight. Pickpockets' longer fixture of crowded daytime markets adapted their techniques for darker, quieter streets, relying less on crowds for cover and more on the simple fact that a victim struck from behind on an unlit street had little hope of identifying an attacker afterward, even if they survived the encounter to treat. One particular category of nighttime crime deserves special mention, both for how specifically it depended on darkness and for how genuinely unsettling it remains even now. In the growing medical schools of the period, demand for cadavers to study human anatomy far outpaced the legal supply, which was generally restricted to the bodies of executed criminals. Into that gap stepped a grim and highly specialized trade, men who made their living entering churchyards after dark to exhume recently buried bodies and sell them quietly and quickly to medical schools, willing to ask few questions about where their specimens had originated. This work depended entirely on darkness for its existence. It could not have functioned in daylight even briefly, and the men who practiced it developed real expertise in working fast, working quietly and vanishing well before the watch, however weakened might happen to pass. Families who could afford it responded with their own countermeasures, hiring guards to sit beside a fresh grave through its first vulnerable nights, or installing heavy iron cages directly over a burial plot. A grim but effective barrier against exactly this specific nocturnal threat. It is a strange and telling detail worth sitting with for a moment. Even the dead in this era were not considered fully safe from what darkness made possible. There is a deeper, more uncomfortable pattern hiding underneath these individual failures, and it is worth pulling out into the light rather than leaving buried beneath a string of amusing anecdotes about drunken aristocrats and bribed watchmen. Every one of these cracks taken individually might look like simple human weakness, the ordinary corruption and cruelty that exists in any large population. Taken together, though they reveal something closer to structural exhaustion, a system asked to police an entire population's nighttime behavior using volunteers or near volunteers working for minimal pay, minimal training, and minimal real authority was always going to strain eventually under the accumulated weight of a growing, changing, increasingly anonymous city. The wonder looking back may not be that the watch eventually failed in places. It may be that such an underfunded ad hoc arrangement managed to hold together as long as it did. This exhaustion showed itself in smaller, quieter ways too, the kind that rarely make it into official records at all, but survive instead in personal letters, diaries, and the occasional exasperated complaint scrawled into a parish ledger by a frustrated local official. Watchmen are recorded falling asleep at their posts, tucked into doorways or leaning against a sentry box, exhausted from working a second job during daylight hours, simply to survive on wages that never seem to keep pace with the cost of ordinary living. Others are recorded abandoning their assigned routes entirely during particularly cold or wet nights, retreating to a nearby tavern for warmth and company, trusting, not always correctly, that nothing serious would happen. During the hour or two, they quietly stepped away. None of this reads as villainy, so much as simple human exhaustion, the ordinary limits of what an underpaid, overworked person can reasonably sustain night after night, year after year, for a wage that barely covered the basics. It raises a question worth sitting with quietly for a moment. What happens to a fear this old, this deeply embedded, across generation after generation of shared caution and inherited warning? Once the very system built to answer it begins visibly publicly failing to do so, does the fear grow sharper now attached to specific documented failures rather than vague old superstition? Or does something else happen instead, a kind of exhausted resignation, an entire population simply adjusting its expectations downward, accepting that the night would always carry some risk that no ordinance, however well-intended, could fully eliminate? Crime records surviving from this period, patchy and inconsistent as they often are, suggest the truth sits somewhere between those two possibilities. Certain categories of nighttime offence, particularly theft and assault in poorly lit districts far from major thoroughfares, appear to climb steadily across the later decades of this era, even as official reports and civic pronouncements continued, insisting with a confidence the underlying numbers did not fully support, that the watch remained equal to its task. Ordinary residents, meanwhile, adapted the way ordinary people generally do when official protection proves unreliable, quietly building their own private layers of defense on top of the crumbling public ones. Sturdier locks appeared on more doors. Private watchmen hired directly by wealthy households or entire streets of concerned neighbours began supplementing the official patrol in certain districts, an early, informal version of a solution that would eventually reshape how cities thought about nighttime safety altogether. This informal, privately funded protection reveals its own quiet unfairness, one that echoes a pattern already familiar from earlier in this story. A prosperous street, its residents pooling money to hire an additional guard or two beyond whatever the official watch could offer, effectively purchased a level of safety that poorer neighbourhoods simply could not afford to replicate. Those poorer districts, often precisely the ones already suffering the worst official neglect, from thinner patrols to fewer working lanterns to watchmen, too discouraged or too poorly paid to walk their full route with any real diligence, were left to absorb whatever criminal activity the wealthier streets had successfully priced out of their own immediate neighbourhood. Danger, in other words, did not disappear as the watch weakened. It simply redistributed itself, flowing quietly toward whichever streets had the least capacity to resist it. A pattern that surviving parish and constabulary records from several major cities describe with a kind of resigned, matter-of-fact consistency that says a great deal about how normalized this unevenness had become. And this is where the story quietly turns, because that same growing frustration, that same accumulating sense that bells and lanterns and rotating civic duty were no longer sufficient answers to the problem was about to collide with something genuinely new. Not a better watchman, not a stricter curfew, something else entirely. An idea simple enough to sound almost obvious in hindsight and yet stubborn enough in practice that it would take real political will, real expense, and no small amount of public argument before anyone managed to make it work. It would begin, as these things so often do, with one determined official deciding that darkness itself, and not merely the crimes it concealed, was finally the problem worth solving directly. History rarely announces its turning points in advance, and this one arrived not as a single dramatic decree, but as a series of stubborn practical decisions made by men who were by most accounts more concerned with tax revenue and public order than with any grand philosophical victory over the dark. Still looking back across the centuries this story has already covered, it is hard not to feel the weight of what happened next. For the first time in recorded history, entire cities began deciding deliberately and systematically to light their own streets through the night. The city most often credited with this shift is Paris, and the man most often named is a newly appointed official whose job title alone tells you something about the scale of ambition behind the change. In the late 1600s, under the reign of a king known for his taste in grandeur and his appetite for centralized control, a new position was created specifically to bring order to the chaos of the capital, a lieutenant general of police, answerable directly to the crown rather than to any single neighborhood or guild. Among his very first acts in office was a decision that must have seemed to many contemporaries almost impossibly ambitious. He ordered lanterns installed at regular intervals across the major streets and intersections of Paris, funded by a new tax levied specifically on the households that would benefit from them, and lit night after night by a growing corps of men hired for exactly that single purpose. What makes this detail genuinely surprising is how quickly and how thoroughly the change actually took hold. Within a remarkably short span of years, thousands of lanterns were burning across Paris each night, suspended on ropes strung between buildings at major crossings, casting a dim but genuinely useful pool of light onto streets that had within living memory been entirely and uniformly black after sunset. Visitors from other European cities, arriving in Paris and encountering this glowing network of streets for the first time, are recorded expressing something close to astonishment and the reputation this earned. The city would outlast the specific lanterns themselves by centuries, echoing eventually into the nickname many people still use for Paris today, a city built at least in part on its own early and genuinely radical relationship with light. There is a quieter, less celebrated story running alongside this famous one, and it deserves equal attention because it complicates any simple version of who truly deserves credit for this turning point. In Amsterdam, just a few years before, Paris made its own dramatic move. A remarkable and somewhat unusual figure had already been working on the exact same problem independently, and with considerably less fanfare. He was by trade and temperament an inventor and painter rather than a career official, a man equally comfortable designing an improved fire hose as he was designing an improved street lantern, and his contribution to this story tends to be overshadowed by the more famous Parisian example, despite arguably preceding it. Working with the city government of Amsterdam, he designed and helped install a genuinely systematic network of oil lanterns across the city, engineering improvements to the lamp design itself that made the flames burn more reliably and required considerably less frequent maintenance than earlier, cruder attempts elsewhere. Historians who study the early history of municipal lighting still debate exactly how to weigh these two achievements against each other, since Amsterdam's effort may have been technically earlier and arguably more thoughtfully engineered, while Paris's version became for reasons of scale, publicity, and the simple fact of being the capital of a powerful and highly visible kingdom, the version that most people came to remember. What the record makes clear either way is that this was not one visionary's isolated idea, but something closer to an idea whose time had genuinely arrived at independently, within a few years of itself, by more than one European city wrestling with the exact same accumulated frustration this story has already traced. The technology itself continued evolving well beyond these first crude installations, and the improvements, though incremental, mattered enormously to anyone actually trying to see by their light. Early lanterns relied on a simple open flame, vulnerable to wind, prone to guttering out entirely on a rainy or blustery night, and offering only a weak, uneven glow that did little to genuinely illuminate a street beyond a small circle directly beneath it. Later generations of lantern design, developed over subsequent decades, incorporated angled, reflective surfaces behind the flame, a deceptively simple innovation that dramatically increased how far a single small light could actually project its glow along a street. These improved reflector lamps eventually became something of a point of civic pride, cities competing quietly with one another over whose streets burned brighter, whose lanterns were spaced more thoughtfully, whose lamplighters kept the most reliable, punctual schedule. It is a small irony worth noting that a technology born out of fear and necessity eventually became in certain circles a genuine source of urban boasting. Not every European city moved at the same pace, and the contrast between them reveals something important about how differently authorities across the continent weighed the cost of this new infrastructure against its benefits. London's own path toward comprehensive public lighting proved considerably slower and more fragmented than the more centralized top-down approach taken in Paris. Rather than a single sweeping royal initiative, London's illumination emerged gradually, through a patchwork of private contracts. Local parish agreements and individual entrepreneurs granted licenses to install and maintain lanterns along specific streets in exchange for collecting fees directly from the households who benefited. The result for decades was an oddly uneven city, certain fashionable or commercially important streets glowing reliably each night, while others, often only a short walk away, remained essentially as dark as they had been a century earlier. Scholars who study the comparative history of these two cities still debate which approach ultimately produced better, more consistent results, since Paris's centralized funding guaranteed broader coverage more quickly, while London's competitive contract-based system arguably encouraged more rapid technical innovation among lampmakers eager to win new business. None of this happened smoothly, and the resistance this new idea encountered deserves just as much honest attention as its eventual success. Lighting an entire city night after night cost real money, and that money had to come from somewhere. The taxes levied to fund these new lantern networks were unsurprisingly deeply unpopular among the very households required to pay them, particularly poorer residents who understood correctly. They were being asked to fund infrastructure whose benefits would flow disproportionately to wealthier neighborhoods with more valuable property to protect and more nighttime business to conduct. Complaints and petitions from this era survive in municipal archives, revealing genuine, sustained public frustration with what many residents experienced not as a gift of safety, but as an unwelcome new financial burden imposed from above. There was resistance of a very different kind as well, quieter and considerably more revealing about what darkness had actually meant to certain segments of the population all along. For those whose livelihoods depended directly on the cover of night, the new lanterns represented a genuine and immediate professional threat. Thieves, smugglers, and others operating outside the law found their usual methods considerably harder to practice under even the modest illumination these early lanterns provided, and lantern breaking quickly emerged as its own quiet, semi-organized form of protest and sabotage. City records from this period document repeated incidents of lanterns smashed, ropes cut, and oil supplies stolen or deliberately spoiled, often in precisely the districts where criminal activity had been most entrenched before the lights arrived. The authorities responded by treating deliberate damage to a public lantern as a serious offence in its own right, sometimes carrying penalties considerably harsher than the underlying crime. The lantern itself had been installed to prevent a telling sign of just how symbolically important this new infrastructure had become to the officials who had staked their reputations on it, even among ordinary law-abiding residents. The response to public lighting was more complicated than simple gratitude. Darkness, for all its dangers, had also long offered something genuinely valuable to people navigating a heavily watched, heavily regulated society, a measure of privacy unavailable anywhere else in daily life. Under cover of night, courting couples could walk together without the constant supervision that daylight streets guaranteed. Religious minorities in certain cities could move between meeting places with somewhat reduced scrutiny. Ordinary people, weary of the intense social visibility that defined daylight life in a small, tightly bound community, had quietly come to value the anonymity that darkness provided, even as they feared its dangers. The arrival of lanterns did not simply illuminate crime, It illuminated everyone for better and for worse, and more than a few residents privately mourned the loss of a darkness that had, whatever its risks, also offered a rare and genuine escape from being constantly seen. There is something quietly poignant in this particular thread of resistance, and it is worth pausing on rather than rushing past. A society that had spent centuries teaching itself to fear the dark had also, almost without realizing it, learned to depend on that same darkness for a handful of genuinely human needs that daylight simply could not accommodate. A servant meeting a sweetheart from a rival household. A tradesman conducting business a jealous competitor was not meant to witness. A person of modest means allowed for just a few hours each night to walk streets that during daylight were dominated entirely by the watchful eyes of neighbours, employers and social superiors. None of this reads as scandalous by modern standards, and much of it was by the standards of the time entirely innocent. But it helps explain why the arrival of light, however welcome in terms of safety, was never received with universal uncomplicated relief. Illumination, it turns out, cuts in more than one direction at once. A new profession emerged directly out of this infrastructure, and it deserves its own small mention here because it represents something genuinely new in this long story. A job that existed for the sole purpose of holding back the dark on a nightly contractual basis. Lamplighters, as they came to be known, walked their assigned routes each evening at dusk, carrying a long pole fitted with a small flame or a taper, methodically lighting one lantern after another along a fixed circuit, and returning again near dawn to extinguish them and begin preparing the wicks and oil reservoirs for the following night. It was steady if unglamorous work, and it introduced something the earlier watch system had never quite managed to offer: a visible, predictable, almost ceremonial marking of the boundary between day and night, performed the same way on the same streets at roughly the same hour evening after evening after evening. Children in these cities are recorded growing up with the lamplighter's evening rounds as one of the small, reliable punctuations of ordinary life. A figure as familiar and expected as the baker at dawn or the church bell at noon. Some residents describe timing their own evening routines by his passage stepping outside to fetch water or finish an errand, just as his pole and flame appeared at the end of the street, trusting the arrival of light the way an earlier generation had trusted the sound of the curfew bell. The lamplighter in this sense inherited something of the old night watchman's symbolic role, not as a figure of enforcement or suspicion, but as a quiet, recurring reassurance that someone, however ordinary, was still tending carefully to the boundary between safety and the dark. It is worth noting, too, that this same profession would go on to survive for centuries in one form or another, adapting eventually from oil to gas and finally fading only with the arrival of electric lighting, meaning that in some cities a lamplighter's evening rounds remained a familiar sight well into living memory, long after the original fears that had inspired the very first lantern would have seemed like distant history even to the people still lighting the flames. What this new infrastructure could not yet do, for all its genuine ambition, was solve the underlying danger of the night entirely, and it would be a mistake to imagine these first lantern networks as some sudden complete transformation. The lanterns were dim by later standards, easily extinguished by wind or rain, spaced widely enough that long stretches of genuine darkness still separated one small pool of flickering light from the next, and limited in these earliest years, mostly to the wealthier and more central districts of whichever city had installed them. For many residents, especially those in poorer, more peripheral neighbourhoods, the practical experience of nighttime remained largely unchanged, still dark, still uncertain, still governed by the same old fears this story has already traced through gates, bells and watchmen. The lantern had arrived. It had not yet conquered anything close to the whole of the night, and in the streets it had not yet reached. The oldest dangers of this story were still very much alive, waiting in exactly the kind of darkness the wealthier districts nearby had only just begun to leave behind. And that incomplete, uneven arrival is precisely where this story now has to turn toward the parts of the city the light did not yet reach, and toward the darkest, most difficult chapter this particular history has to offer. There is a particular kind of darkness this story has not yet fully entered, and it deserves to be approached carefully, with the same steady attention given to everything that came before it. Not every danger born from the night in this era was a matter of stolen purses or broken lanterns. Some of it reached far deeper into the way entire communities turned against their own neighbours, and into moments when the absence of light became not simply an opportunity for crime, but a weapon deliberately chosen by people who understood exactly what darkness could hide. Consider first how deeply the fear of night became entangled with one of the most devastating chapters of this entire era. The widespread persecution of people accused of witchcraft across large stretches of Europe, stretching from roughly the 1400s through the final decades of the 1600s and beyond in some regions. Historians studying this long, painful history still debate its precise causes, weighing religious anxiety, economic hardship, political upheaval, and simple human scapegoating against one another. And no single explanation fully accounts for why these panics erupted so intensely in certain places and periods while remaining largely absent in others. What the surviving court records do make clear again and again is how frequently the specific accusations at the heart of these trials centered on events that had supposedly happened after dark. A neighbor's cow found dead or ailing at dawn might be traced back to a strange shape reportedly seen crossing a field the previous night. An unexplained noise outside a window in the small hours, a shadow moving where no shadow should have been, a light glimpsed flickering in an isolated cottage long after every honest household had gone quiet. Any of these ordinary explainable features of a dark and largely unlit countryside could become, under the right conditions of fear and suspicion, the foundation of an accusation that would end a person's life. The imagined gatherings at the center of so many of these trials, the meetings supposedly held by accused witches to plot harm against their communities, were almost universally described as taking place at night, in remote locations beyond the reach of any watchman, any curfew bell, any of the ordinary daylight structures of accountability. This story has already traced in such careful detail. The overwhelming majority of those accused and executed across this long, painful period were women, particularly older women, widowed or otherwise living outside the direct protection of a husband or adult son, and the connection to nighttime fear here is worth drawing out carefully. A woman living alone was, by the social logic of this era, already someone whose movements after dark drew suspicion rather than sympathy. Exactly the pattern this story touched on earlier when tracing how differently men and women experienced the ordinary risks of the night. That existing suspicion layered onto genuine economic tension between neighbours, a poor harvest, a sudden illness, a dispute over land or inheritance could curdle with startling speed into an accusation once someone recalled or claimed to recall having glimpsed that same woman abroad at an hour when no honest person was thought to be out. The night did not simply provide the imagined setting for these alleged crimes. It provided the entire social framework of suspicion that made an accusation plausible to begin with. Estimates for how many people were executed across the full span of this persecution vary considerably among historians, and the evidence remains genuinely incomplete in many regions where records were poorly kept or have since been lost. Serious modern scholarship generally places the total somewhere in the tens of thousands across the continent, though the exact figure and the precise regional patterns behind it continue to be refined as archives are studied more closely. What remains consistent across nearly every region examined, regardless of the total count eventually settled on, is the recurring presence of nighttime testimony. At the center of these cases, an accusation almost always rooted in something someone claimed to have witnessed or imagined, once the ordinary daylight world had gone quiet. There is a hidden mechanism worth naming plainly here, because it explains something important about why these accusations proved so devastatingly difficult to survive once made. In a world without artificial light, without reliable clocks, without any of the ordinary means a modern person might use to establish exactly where they were, and when an accusation of nighttime wrongdoing was nearly impossible to disprove. Most people, after all, had no witnesses for their own whereabouts during the deep hours of the night. They'd been asleep or nearly solo, or beside a spouse who could hardly be considered an impartial witness in the eyes of a suspicious court. Darkness, which had already been treated for centuries as a realm outside the reach of ordinary law and ordinary proof, now became a realm where accusation alone could stand in for evidence, because the very conditions that made the night dangerous also made it nearly impossible to establish innocence within it. In certain regions, during the most intense years of this persecution, the ordinary machinery of nighttime control. This story has already traced in such detail the watch, the curfew, the rotating civic duty of ordinary citizens was quietly repurposed to serve this new and far darker priority. Local authorities in some communities are recorded specifically instructing watchmen to note and report any unusual nighttime activity that might suggest witchcraft, blurring the line between a patrol meant to catch an ordinary thief and one meant to gather evidence against a suspected neighbour. A watchman's simple factual report a light seen burning at an unusual hour, a figure noticed walking alone toward the edge of town, could take on an entirely different weight and meaning, depending on who was doing the reporting and what fears already occupied the community receiving it. The very institution built centuries earlier to protect ordinary households from the dangers of the dark had in these specific and painful instances become an instrument for manufacturing danger where none had actually existed. This pattern of nighttime suspicion feeding directly into violence extended well beyond the specific context of witchcraft accusations, and it is worth widening the lens slightly to see the fuller shape of it. Religious and political minorities across various periods of this era found themselves similarly vulnerable to exactly this same dynamic, accused of secret nighttime gatherings, forbidden rituals conducted under cover of darkness, or conspiracies plotted where no honest witness could observe them. The details of these accusations shifted considerably depending on the specific religious or political conflict involved, but the underlying structure remained remarkably consistent. Darkness, already understood by an entire civilization as inherently suspicious, provided a ready-made framework onto which almost any fear, religious, political, or purely personal, could be projected and made to look plausible. This same quality of darkness, its capacity to erase witnesses and swallow accountability, made it a tool chosen deliberately by those planning violence on a far larger and more organized scale than any single accusation. One of the starkest examples from this era unfolded in Paris itself, the very city this story has already followed through its earliest experiments with public lighting. In the summer of the year 1572, amid the deep religious and political divisions tearing at the kingdom, a coordinated wave of killings began before dawn, signalled according to surviving accounts by the ringing of a church bell in the darkness, the very same kind of bell that had for centuries called this city's residents to prayer, to curfew, to safety. Under cover of that remaining darkness, armed groups moved through streets they knew intimately, targeting specific households before most of the city had even woken to understand what was happening. By the time full daylight arrived, the violence had already spread beyond anyone's original intention, continuing for days, but its opening hours belonged entirely to the dark chosen, deliberately, because darkness offered exactly what its planners needed: confusion, concealment, and the crucial element of surprise that daylight could never have provided. It would be a mistake to treat this single well-documented event as an isolated horror rather than an example of a pattern that recurs in smaller and larger forms throughout this entire era. Mob violence across pre-industrial Europe when it erupted, disproportionately erupted after dark and for reasons that make grim practical sense, once you consider everything this story has already established about how nighttime worked. A crowd gathering in daylight is visible, identifiable, answerable to a functioning watch and a functioning system of witnesses. A crowd gathering after the curfew bell has already emptied the streets of everyone with legitimate business to be seen faces none of those same constraints. Anonymity, the very quality that made darkness feel dangerous to an ordinary traveller. Walking home made it equally attractive to those seeking to commit violence without consequence, whether against an accused witch, a religious minority, or simply a personal enemy whose death could be more easily disguised as the work of anonymous nighttime criminals than openly claimed in daylight. Historians who study the broader pattern of mob violence across this era have noted a further more practical dimension to this preference for darkness, one that has less to do with concealment and more to do with control. A crowd assembling after dark beyond the reach of a functioning watch was also a crowd operating beyond the reach of whatever restraint a visible daylight authority might otherwise impose. Local officials who might have hesitated to confront a mob in broad daylight, wary of provoking a larger confrontation in full view of the entire town, often found themselves genuinely unable to respond at all. Once violence erupted after the curfew bell, arriving only afterward, often at dawn, to catalogue the damage and the dead rather than to have prevented either. The very darkness that had once been treated as something requiring official control had in these moments become something no official control could reliably reach at all. It is worth pausing to ask a quiet, difficult question here, one. This entire story has been circling from its very first moments. What does it mean that an entire civilization across so many centuries came to understand its own nights as a space where the ordinary rules simply did not fully apply? Not merely dangerous in the way a dark alley or an unlit road might be dangerous, but dangerous in a deeper, more structural sense. A recurring nightly gap in the fabric of accountability that both criminals and at times entire communities learn to exploit with grim practical fluency. Not every death connected to this fear reached the scale of a massacre or the formality of a trial. Far more common and in many ways just as telling were the smaller, quieter tragedies that surviving parish and coroner's records preserve in careful, unglamorous detail. A traveller found at first light along a rural road, robbed and killed sometime in the preceding hours, with no witness able to offer more than a vague description of movement glimpsed in poor moonlight. A household attacked in the depths of the night by intruders who vanished long before any neighbour watchman or constable could respond meaningfully to the alarm. These cases rarely produce convictions. The same darkness that had enabled the crime generally protected its perpetrator afterward as well, and the surviving records of this era are quietly full of cases marked in one form or another as unresolved, the killer unknown, the circumstances unclear, the night itself effectively closing the investigation before it had properly begun. One such case, preserved in unusual detail thanks to a conscientious local official, describes a wool merchant found along a country road on a winter morning, having apparently been attacked the previous evening while returning from a market some distance away. The surviving account notes his goods missing his purse. Empty and almost nothing else of substance, no witness, no suspect, no clear sequence of events beyond the simple, aching fact of a man who had set out for home in fading light and never arrived. Cases like this one rarely made it into any grander historical narrative. They survive only because someone somewhere thought it worth the ink and the time to write down what little could be established, and then just as honestly to record that nothing further could be known. Multiplied across thousands of similar entries scattered through parish ledgers and coroners' rolls across an entire continent, these small unresolved tragedies form their own quiet cumulative testimony to just how completely the night could close around a single ordinary life and simply keep its secrets. And yet even within this darkest portion of the story, something worth holding on to persists. The very fact that these events were recorded at all, however incompletely, however imperfectly, speaks to a stubborn human insistence on bearing witness, even to crimes the darkness itself had tried to erase. Parish clerks, coroners, and court officials across this era continued generation after generation to write down what they could piece together, preserving names, dates, and fragments of testimony that might otherwise have vanished entirely into the same darkness that had swallowed the events themselves. That instinct to record even what could not be solved, to insist that a life lost in darkness still deserved a line in the record, is itself a quiet act of resistance against everything the night at its most brutal had tried to accomplish. It is a small thing. A single clerk's careful handwriting entered into a ledger that might never again be opened by anyone who cared, but it represents something worth carrying forward into the rest of this story. Even in an era that so often treated the night as a space beyond the reach of accountability, there remained people determined to insist, otherwise one entry, one name, one incomplete but honestly recorded fact at a time. What survives from this era, scattered across court records, parish registers, and the occasional surviving diary or pamphlet, is the closest thing available to a genuine window into how these events actually unfolded, distinct from folklore exaggeration or the comfortable distance of later retelling. Turning toward that evidence directly and toward what it can and cannot actually tell us with confidence is where this story goes next. Every story told about the past eventually has to answer a quiet, unglamorous question one. This particular story has so far mostly set aside in favor of atmosphere and narrative momentum. How do we actually know any of this? Not the folklore, not the later retellings, not the comfortable shape. A modern storyteller might be tempted to impose on centuries of scattered, imperfect human experience, but the underlying evidence itself sitting in archives and record offices, waiting for anyone patient enough to read it closely. The most direct window into this history comes from the ordinary bureaucratic paperwork of pre-industrial justice, the kind of document nobody at the time imagined would one day be treated as precious. Coroners across England, for instance, were legally required to investigate any sudden or unexplained death and their surviving rolls. Thousands of individual entries stretching back centuries record not just the cause of death, but frequently the approximate hour, the immediate circumstances, and the coroner's own judgment about whether the death resulted from misadventure murder or something in between. Reading through a long run of these entries in sequence produces an oddly vivid, almost cinematic sense of how nighttime danger actually distributed itself across an ordinary population, not through any single dramatic account, but through the sheer accumulated weight of hundreds of small, individually unremarkable tragedies. One pattern emerges from these records with striking consistency, and it concerns a category of death that rarely features in popular imagination of this era at all. Alongside the murders, robberies, and violent assaults this story has already traced, coroners' rolls are disproportionately filled with deaths, attributed simply to misadventure after dark, people who drowned, crossing a familiar stream they could no longer see clearly, who fell into open wells or unfinished building excavations, who wandered off a known path in fog or darkness and succumbed to exposure before morning. Drowning in particular appears again and again in these records, often in bodies of water shallow and unremarkable enough that a person moving confidently in daylight would have crossed them without a second thought. The night, it turns out, did not need a criminal at all to be genuinely lethal. It simply needed an ordinary person, a small misjudgment, and the total absence of any light by which to correct course. Court transcripts offer a different, more detailed kind of evidence, and one particular surviving archive deserves special mention here, both for its scale and for how directly it illuminates the specific question this story keeps circling back to. The published proceedings of London's Central Criminal Court, covering an extraordinary span of years and preserving something close to verbatim testimony from thousands of individual trials, allow historians to read the actual words witnesses used to describe what they had seen or thought they had seen in the dark. These accounts are remarkable precisely because of their honesty about uncertainty. Witnesses describe recognizing an attacker by voice alone, having caught no useful glimpse of a face. They describe estimating a stranger's height or build from a silhouette against a slightly lighter sky. They describe again and again the specific frustration of having been close enough to a crime to become its victim, yet too blind in the darkness to offer the court anything beyond the vaguest possible description of who had committed it. This pattern in the surviving testimony connects to something researchers studying crime records from this era have identified with real statistical clarity, even while continuing to debate exactly how to interpret it. Violent crime, measured simply as incidents per hour rather than as a raw daily total, appears to have occurred at a dramatically higher rate during the nighttime hours than during daylight, even though far fewer people were actually out and moving during those same nighttime hours to serve as potential victims or witnesses. In other words, the danger was not simply that crime happened at night, because more crime happened everywhere. It was that any given hour after dark carried a genuinely disproportionate share of the total violence recorded across an entire day, concentrated into a window when the streets held only a fraction of their daytime population. Historians studying this pattern continue to debate precisely how much of it reflects real underlying danger, as opposed to the different kinds of people who tended to be out at night in the first place, since labourers finishing late shifts, travellers arriving after a long journey, and those engaged in illicit business of their own, all shared those same dark hours in uneven proportion to the general population. There is a detail buried within this same body of court testimony that tends to genuinely surprise people because it reveals a piece of practical criminal knowledge that has almost entirely vanished from modern awareness. Robbers operating along rural roads and forest paths, according to repeated testimony preserved across numerous surviving trials, actively planned their activities around the phases of the moon. A bright, clear, moonlit night offered enough incidental illumination to make an ambush considerably riskier, since a potential victim might glimpse a waiting figure from a genuinely useful distance, and a fleeing robber might be more easily pursued and identified afterward by witnesses who could actually see him run. The period immediately surrounding the new moon, when the night sky offered essentially no natural illumination at all, appears repeatedly in period slang and courtroom testimony as the preferred working conditions for this particular kind of crime, described by contemporaries using phrases that translate roughly to working in the dark of the moon. It is a strange thing to consider that criminals of this era effectively kept their own private astronomical calendar, planning their most dangerous work around a celestial cycle the rest of the population barely thought to track. This same lunar awareness cut in the opposite direction as well, and travellers who could arrange their own timing accordingly learned to treat a full moon as something close to a small free gift of security. Merchants planning a journey that might run late into the evening are recorded in surviving letters and travel accounts, deliberately timing their departures around the lunar calendar, preferring to risk the roads on a bright, moonlit night rather than an equally convenient but considerably darker one only a week or two earlier or later. Innkeepers along well-travelled routes reportedly noticed the pattern themselves, observing that trade and foot traffic through their doors tended to thin out noticeably in the days surrounding a new moon, as though an entire travelling population had quietly synchronized its caution to the same silent clock hanging overhead. It is a small, almost charming detail, easy to miss amid the grimmer material. This story has already covered, and yet it captures something genuinely important about how thoroughly ordinary people had learned to read and respond to the natural rhythms governing their own safety long before any lantern or ordnance offered them an alternative. Alongside the official record, an entirely different, considerably less reliable kind of literature also flourished around this same subject matter, and untangling the two requires real care. Cheap printed pamphlets and collections detailing the exploits of notorious criminals circulated widely across this era, sold on street corners and read aloud in taverns. And while many of these accounts drew loosely on genuine court proceedings, they were rarely content to stick to the actual, often anticlimactic facts. A robbery that court records describe in a single flat sentence might, by the time it reached a popular printed pamphlet, have grown into a dramatic confrontation full of clever dialogue and daring escapes that no surviving transcript actually supports. Modern historians working with material from this era have to read carefully across both kinds of source, treating the official record as the more trustworthy foundation, while recognizing that the popular literature, however embellished, still reveals something valuable about what ordinary readers found thrilling, frightening, or worth paying a coin to read about on a given evening. Watch logs themselves where they survive, and yet another layer to this picture, and they are, if anything, the least glamorous of all the surviving sources this story draws on, kept by parish officials responsible for overseeing the rotating civic duty. This story traced in such detail earlier, these logs typically record little more than names, assigned shifts, and the occasional brief note about an incident worth flagging for a magistrate's attention. Read individually. A single page from one of these logs tells almost nothing. Read across an entire surviving run spanning months or years. A different picture slowly emerges, one of genuine grinding routine, interrupted only occasionally by anything resembling real drama. Most nights, according to these logs, passed without significant incident at all, the watchman completing his rounds, noting nothing more remarkable than a dog barking or a door found unexpectedly unlocked. It is a useful, quietly reassuring corrective to any temptation to imagine every single night of this era as uniformly perilous. For the overwhelming majority of ordinary people on the overwhelming majority of ordinary nights, ordinary life simply continued cautiously but without incident exactly as it had the night before. Parish registers recording births, marriages, and deaths across entire communities offer a further, more indirect kind of evidence, useful precisely because they were never intended to document danger at all. Cross-referencing the recorded time or approximate circumstances of a death against the broader pattern of daily life in a given parish allows historians to build a rough, admittedly imperfect picture of how nighttime risk actually distributed itself across different seasons, different occupations, and different stages of life. Deaths connected to travel, for instance, cluster noticeably around certain seasonal patterns tied to market days, harvest timing, and religious festivals, precisely the occasions when ordinary people were most likely to find themselves travelling later than usual, caught by failing light on a road they had judged in daylight to be perfectly manageable. There is also the matter of whose experience made it into the record at all, and this particular gap deserves honest acknowledgement rather than quiet omission. Crimes against servants, labourers, and the very poor were, by consistent historical pattern, considerably less likely to result in a formal court case than equivalent crimes against wealthier victims, simply because pursuing justice through this era's legal system required time, money, and social standing that many ordinary people simply did not possess. A wealthy merchant robbed on his way home from a late business meeting had real recourse resources and social pressure available to pursue his attacker through the courts. A servant girl assaulted on the same street walking home from the same kind of late errand often had none of those same advantages, and her case, if it appears in any surviving record at all, is far more likely to survive only as a brief, unresolved coroner's entry than as a fully documented trial. The surviving archive, in other words, almost certainly understates the true burden of nighttime danger, carried by exactly the population this story has already identified as most vulnerable to it. Those without the wealth, standing, or connections to translate their suffering into a case any court would formally hear. What emerges from all of this taken together carefully and honestly is not a single clean statistic or a tidy, satisfying conclusion, but something closer to a textured, layered picture genuinely useful precisely because of its complexity. The night was dangerous, measurably and disproportionately so in ways the surviving records confirm again and again across different countries, different centuries, and different kinds of documentation. It was also simultaneously a great deal more ordinary than its darkest surviving stories might suggest, populated far more often by tired travellers, careless drunks and unlucky accidents than by the deliberate violence that fills the most memorable court transcripts and criminal pamphlets. Both of these truths sit comfortably together once you understand where each one comes from, and holding them together, rather than choosing one over the other, is probably the most honest way to understand what these long centuries of nighttime fear actually meant for the people who lived through them. It is worth resisting, too, the temptation to flatten this evidence into a single tidy verdict on how dangerous the past truly was compared to the present. A comparison this kind of record can never fully support. The categories these historical documents use, the standards of proof applied by a coroner or a magistrate, the very definitions of what counted as a reportable crime, all differed considerably from anything a modern reader would recognize, and translating between the two eras involves more genuine uncertainty than a confident modern headline might suggest. What these documents can offer reliably and honestly is not a precise body count to set against modern statistics, but something arguably more valuable for a story like this one, a genuine, textured sense of how the people actually living through these centuries understood, feared, and quietly managed the risks of their own particular darkness. Not everyone who studied this evidence over the years reached the same conclusions, and the disagreements among historians themselves turn out to be almost as revealing as the records they argue over. Some researchers, working primarily from the darker, more dramatic material this story has already explored, have emphasized just how genuinely perilous ordinary nighttime movement could be, particularly for the poor, for women, and for anyone traveling alone. Others, drawing more heavily on the quieter watch logs and the largely uneventful stretches of parish record, have pushed back against what they see as an exaggerated, overly dramatic picture inherited from the popular pamphlets and criminal literature of the era itself, arguing that most people on most nights moved through their own familiar darkness with considerably less dread than modern retellings tend to assume. That ongoing scholarly conversation and the different ways serious researchers have chosen to weigh the very same surviving documents against one another is where this story turns next. Serious scholarly attention to the history of night itself is in the grand scheme of academic disciplines. A remarkably recent development, and understanding why helps explain some of the genuine disagreement this story is about to walk through. For a very long time, historians studying pre-industrial Europe simply treated the night as a kind of blank space between the events that actually mattered. The daylight hours when markets opened, armies marched, and rulers issued their decrees. Darkness, by this older approach, was assumed to be largely uneventful, a period when ordinary life essentially paused until morning. It took a genuinely patient body of research gathered, piece by piece, from coroners' rolls, court transcripts, private diaries, and parish records scattered across archives in multiple countries, to reveal just how much had actually been happening in those supposedly empty hours all along. One particularly influential synthesis of this material, published in the early years of the current century, is widely credited with transforming night from a footnote in historical writing into a genuine subject worthy of its own sustained study, drawing together evidence that had previously sat scattered and unconnected across dozens of separate, narrower research projects. That same foundational research also introduced one of the more genuinely contested ideas this story has already touched on, the theory that many people across pre-industrial Europe slept in two distinct segments through the night rather than in one continuous stretch. The evidence supporting this idea, drawn from a wide range of surviving written sources, describing a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, struck many readers as both surprising and, on reflection, entirely plausible. Not every historian, however, has been equally convinced of how far this pattern extended. Some researchers argue the practice was considerably more common among certain social classes or in certain regions than others, shaped as much by local custom, occupation, and household circumstance as by any universal biological rhythm shared by the entire species. Others have pushed the debate in a different direction entirely, pointing to a controlled sleep laboratory study conducted in the final decade of the previous century, in which participants placed in conditions of extended nightly darkness, deliberately mimicking the shortened daylight hours of a pre-industrial winter, spontaneously began sleeping in two segments within a matter of weeks. That experiment lends real scientific weight to the idea that segmented sleep may reflect a genuine, dormant human biological pattern, simply suppressed in the modern world by artificial light and rigid daytime schedules rather than a habit adopted purely out of cultural or practical necessity. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how to weigh these different lines of research against one another, and the honest answer for now is that both explanations likely hold some truth intertwined in ways that continuing research may eventually help separate more clearly. This debate carries a genuinely surprising layer of its own, because the language people once used to describe that middle stretch of nighttime wakefulness appears to have simply vanished from common use once the practice itself faded sometime around the era of widespread artificial lighting this story has already traced. Terms referring to a first sleep and a second sleep, once common enough to appear casually in personal letters, medical advice, and even literary works without any need for explanation, gradually dropped out of everyday language entirely so thoroughly that by the time modern historians began searching for them, the phrases themselves had to be actively rediscovered rather than simply recalled from living memory or ordinary reference works. It is an unusual example of an entire once ordinary human experience essentially disappearing from a language's working vocabulary within a handful of generations, evidence, in its own quiet way, of just how completely artificial light eventually reshaped something as fundamental as how people slept. Skeptics of the theory point out a different kind of gap in the evidence, one worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Much of the written material describing this pattern of segmented sleep comes disproportionately from literate, relatively prosperous households, simply because those were the households most likely to leave behind diaries, letters, and other personal writing in the first place. Whether labourers, servants, and the rural poor experienced this same pattern with equal consistency remains considerably harder to establish, since their nights by definition left far fewer written traces behind for any historian to later examine. The evidence remains incomplete on this particular point, and it may simply remain so, given how thoroughly the written record of this era already tilts toward the literate and the comfortable rather than the ordinary labourer, whose exhausting daily work likely left little energy and even less inclination for describing exactly how he slept. A second, considerably more emotionally weighted debate concerns the fundamental nature of the fear this entire story has traced from its opening moments. One school of thought drawing heavily on the darkest material this story has already covered, the witch trials, the mob violence, the grim coroner's entries recording unexplained deaths, argues that the fear of night reflected a genuinely rational response to genuinely elevated danger. A population correctly reading the real statistical risk embedded in its own daily experience and organizing its behavior accordingly. A different school of thought argues that this picture, however well documented in its darkest examples, still overstates the ordinary emotional experience of most people on most nights, suggesting instead that centuries of religious teaching, moral instruction, and inherited folklore had trained an entire civilization to fear the dark considerably more intensely than the underlying day-to-day statistical risk actually warranted. On this reading, the night watch, the curfew bells, and the elaborate machinery of nighttime control, this story has traced in such detail we're responding at least as much to a culturally constructed anxiety as to any precisely calibrated assessment of genuine physical danger. It is a genuinely difficult question to resolve with confidence, and it is worth pausing to consider why. What does it actually mean to separate a real danger from an exaggerated fear, when the two have been so thoroughly entangled, generation after generation, in the same sermons, the same bedtime warnings, the same civic ordinances, that neither the people living through this era nor the historians studying it centuries later can fully pull them apart? A parent warning a child not to wander past the edge of the firelight was responding in some real sense to both the statistical reality of nighttime crime and the deeper cultural weight darkness had accumulated across centuries of moral teaching and untangling. Which motivation dominated in any single instance may simply be impossible from this historical distance. This story has so far focused almost entirely on Europe, and that focus deserves honest acknowledgement because the underlying pattern it describes was never uniquely European at all. Cities across other parts of the world developed remarkably similar responses to remarkably similar fears, often independently and centuries apart from anything happening in England or France. Imperial China maintained elaborate systems of nighttime curfew stretching back many centuries, with drum towers marking the hours and city gates closing on a fixed schedule, not unlike the walled European towns this story described earlier, enforced by officials whose duties would have felt entirely familiar to a medieval English gatekeeper. Cities across the Ottoman world similarly regulated movement after dark, though, with notably different social textures woven into that regulation, including a rich tradition of nighttime gatherings during Jie, certain religious months that briefly inverted the usual rules, filling streets and coffee houses with light conversation and activity precisely during the hours a European visitor might have expected to find total silence. There is a genuinely striking detail buried within that Ottoman comparison worth drawing out more fully because it complicates the simple universal picture of night as purely fearful territory that this story has largely followed up to this point. Coffee houses across major Ottoman cities became over time genuine centers of nighttime social life, particularly once the introduction of coffee itself spread widely enough to support an entire evening culture built around conversation, storytelling, and shared entertainment held well after dark. Travelers from Europe visiting these cities sometimes recorded genuine surprise at encountering streets and gathering places, still animated, lit, and full of ordinary social life at hours when their own home cities would have been entirely dark and silent behind bolted doors. This does not mean these cities face no nighttime danger of their own, since surviving records suggest they wrestled with many of the same basic concerns around theft and disorder that this story has already traced elsewhere. It does suggest, though, that the particular intensity of nighttime dread this story has focused on was not some universal, inevitable human response to darkness itself, but rather a specific cultural formation shaped by a particular religious traditions, particular legal structures, and particular historical circumstances that varied meaningfully from one civilization to another. Japan's own tradition of nighttime civic control offers a further point of genuinely useful comparison, distinct enough in its details to resist any easy assumption that every society simply arrived at the same solution independently. During the long era of relative internal peace that followed centuries of civil conflict, Japanese cities maintained networks of the neighborhood gates, closed each night and reopened each morning, dividing entire urban districts into smaller, more easily monitored sections in a manner that echoes in its underlying logic the walled towns and locked gates. This story described so thoroughly in its earlier chapters. Watchmen stationed at these gates recorded the movement of residents passing through after dark, and travelers without sufficient explanation for their nighttime journey could, much like their European counterparts centuries earlier and an ocean away, find themselves detained until a more convincing account could be offered. The strikingly similar shape of these independent solutions developed by societies with no meaningful contact or shared cultural inheritance suggests something genuinely interesting about how differently organized human community faced with the same basic problem of nighttime disorder tended to arrive at broadly comparable answers, even while the specific texture and cultural meaning of those answers varied considerably from one civilization to the next. Historians working across these different regional traditions continue to debate how much genuine cross-cultural comparison this pattern actually supports, since the surviving evidence from outside Europe remains considerably thinner and less systematically studied than the archives this story has drawn on so far, and firm conclusions about a truly universal human response to darkness would be getting ahead of what the current research can actually support. The witch trials this story examined earlier generate their own distinct and ongoing scholarly argument, one worth revisiting now from a slightly different angle than before. Early researchers studying this history tended to favor relatively simple single-cause explanations, attributing the panics primarily to religious fanaticism or alternatively to a form of mass psychological hysteria sweeping through vulnerable communities. More recent scholarship has generally moved away from any single tidy explanation, favoring instead a more layered account that weighs religious doctrine, genuine economic hardship, shifting legal procedures that made prosecution easier in certain periods, and the particular vulnerability of women living outside direct male protection, all interacting together rather than any one factor standing alone as the true root cause. Regional variation within Europe itself adds a further layer of complexity to this same debate, one that any single overarching explanation struggles to fully accommodate. Certain territories experienced remarkably intense concentrations of prosecutions within a relatively narrow window of years, while neighboring regions sharing much of the same religious tradition and general cultural background saw comparatively few cases across the same period. Historians studying this uneven geography have connected it to differences in local legal procedure, particularly whether a given jurisdiction permitted torture to extract confessions, and how readily local courts accepted spectral or circumstantial testimony as sufficient grounds for conviction, factors that could dramatically accelerate or dampen a panic once accusations began circulating within a community. This regional unevenness argues against any single, sweeping explanation applying equally everywhere, and it has pushed recent scholarship toward increasingly localized studies examining individual regions and even individual court records in close detail, rather than attempting one grand theory to explain the entire continental pattern at once. There is something quietly reassuring in its own way about watching serious historians argue this carefully and this honestly over material that could easily be flattened into a simpler, more dramatic story. The disagreement itself is a kind of quality control, a sign that the people studying this history are treating the evidence with the seriousness it deserves, rather than reaching for whichever interpretation makes the best story. A storyteller, working from a comfortable distance and wanting only a satisfying narrative arc, might be tempted to pick the most dramatic reading available and present it as settled fact. A historian bound by the actual limitations of the surviving record generally cannot afford that same comfort and the resulting caution. However less thrilling it might sound, tends to produce a considerably more trustworthy picture in the end. What emerges from all of this scholarly disagreement taken honestly and without forcing a false resolution is a night considerably more complicated than either the darkest folklore or the most reassuring statistical correction can fully capture on its own. It was dangerous in ways the surviving record confirms repeatedly and specifically. It was also shaped deeply and thoroughly by fears that outran the underlying statistics, in certain respects fears woven so completely into religion, custom and inherited warning that separating genuine risk from cultural anxiety may never be fully possible even with centuries more research. And it was at the very same time considerably more ordinary, more survivable, and more filled with quiet, uneventful routine than either the grimmest surviving trial record or the most anxious surviving sermon might suggest on its own. None of this in the end changed what actually happened once the sun went down, for the ordinary people living through all of it gate by gate, bell by bell, generation after generation. Whatever the precise balance between genuine risk and inherited fear, the night still had to be survived, and surviving it left its own lasting mark on how these societies built their homes, arranged their families, and organized the very rhythm of daily existence long after any individual dark night had passed. That endurance is in its own quiet way the most honest conclusion this particular debate can offer. Historians may continue disagreeing for years to come over exactly how much of this old fear was earned by genuine statistical danger and how much was inherited, amplified and passed down through sermon and story rather than direct experience. What no serious researcher disputes, regardless of which side of these debates they ultimately land on, is that the fear itself was real, consequential, and thoroughly woven into how an entire civilization organized its evenings for the better part of 1,000 years. That deeper, more lasting imprint, the quiet architecture of habit and custom that centuries of nighttime caution left behind, is where this story turns next. Fear this old and this persistent does not simply fade once the danger prompting it eases. It settles instead into the structure of ordinary life, quietly reshaping the law, the architecture, and the daily habits of people who may never have consciously connected their own routines to centuries of accumulated nighttime caution. Tracing those consequences forward reveals just how deeply this long relationship with darkness worked its way into the ordinary fabric of pre-industrial existence, long after any single curfew bell or watchman's lantern had done its work. The legal system offers one of the clearest, most concrete examples of this lasting imprint, and it survives in a place many people would never think to look the specific technical definition of a single common crime. Under English common law developed and refined over centuries, the crime of burglary was defined with unusual precision around the element of time. Breaking into a dwelling was not, by the strict legal definition inherited from this era, automatically considered burglary at all. The act had to occur specifically during the hours of darkness, generally understood as running from sunset to sunrise, for the law to apply its harshest available label and its correspondingly harsher punishment. The exact same physical act, breaking a lock, forcing a door, entering a home uninvited, carried a meaningfully different legal weight, depending entirely on whether the sun happened to be above or below the horizon at the moment it occurred. This distinction, preserved in legal textbooks and court practice for centuries, offers a striking, very literal illustration of everything this story has already traced. The law itself, in its most formal and technical language, treated nighttime intrusion as categorically more frightening, more dangerous, and more deserving of severe punishment than the identical act committed in daylight, codifying in precise legal terminology. An anxiety that had been building in ordinary communities for centuries before any lawyer ever wrote the distinction down. This same legal logic extended well beyond burglary alone, shaping how courts across this era approached violence more broadly. An assault or a killing that occurred after dark was in many jurisdictions treated with a presumption of premeditation and malice that a similar incident occurring in broad daylight did not automatically carry, on the reasoning that anyone choosing to commit violence under cover of darkness had deliberately selected conditions designed to avoid witnesses and evade capture, a choice the law treated as morally significant in its own right, distinct from the underlying violence itself. Some historians studying the development of criminal law across this period suggest this nighttime presumption may represent one of the earliest formal legal acknowledgements of what a modern court would recognize as aggravating circumstance, the idea that the same underlying act can carry different legal and moral weight depending on the specific conditions surrounding it. The evidence for how consistently this reasoning was applied varies considerably from region to region and across different centuries, and legal historians continue refining exactly how uniform this pattern actually was across the many separate jurisdictions of pre-industrial Europe. Household habits around valuables reflect this same deep legal and cultural association between darkness and heightened risk. Wealthier families across this era commonly maintained specific evening rituals for securing their most valuable possessions. Moving coin plate and important documents into locked chests or hidden compartments as part of the same nightly closing routine that saw shutters barred and fires banked. Merchants operating out of ground floor shops attached to their homes routinely built specific reinforced storage spaces, sometimes little more than a heavily bolted cupboard, sometimes an entire separate strong room specifically to protect inventory and cash reserves through the vulnerable overnight hours when the shop itself stood unwatched and unlit. This nightly ritual of securing valuables, so ordinary and unremarkable to the people practicing it that it rarely warranted comment in surviving personal writing, nonetheless represents its own small telling piece of evidence for just how completely the specific hours of darkness had become associated in the practical thinking of ordinary households with heightened vulnerability to loss. Architecture absorbed this same accumulated caution in ways that remain visible if you know how to look for them in surviving buildings from this era. City housing across many parts of Europe developed distinctive defensive features specifically oriented around nighttime vulnerability. Ground floor windows in many older urban buildings were built deliberately small and set unusually high above street level, a design choice that sacrificed daytime light and ventilation in exchange for making it considerably harder for anyone to climb through unnoticed after dark. Heavy wooden shutters, often reinforced with iron bars or bolts, became standard fixtures on street-facing windows across entire cities, closed and secured every single evening as part of an ordinary household's closing routine, as automatic and unremarkable as locking a door is today. In certain northern European cities, entire residential courtyards developed around a single heavily secured gated entrance, allowing multiple households to share the practical burden of maintaining one well-guarded point of entry rather than each family securing an individual, more vulnerable street door on its own. The canal houses of Amsterdam, the very city this story has already visited, in connection with its early experiments in public lighting, developed their own distinctive set of defensive features shaped by this same accumulated caution adapted specifically to a city built along narrow waterways rather than the walled perimeters of more traditional fortified towns. Front doors on these houses were typically raised above street level, accessed by a small flight of exterior steps, a design choice that offered a practical defense against periodic flooding, but also created a small deliberate barrier between the street and the entrance itself, forcing anyone approaching after dark to climb and therefore be heard before reaching the actual door. Heavy iron hardware, ornate by daylight but genuinely functional after dark, secured shutters and doors with a thoroughness that surviving examples still demonstrate today. Some fitted with multiple separate locking mechanisms operated from the inside, layered redundancy built directly into the architecture of an ordinary family home. Door knockers and bells themselves carry their own small piece of this story, often overlooked entirely by anyone encountering them today as simple decorative hardware. Many surviving examples from this era were deliberately designed to produce a distinctive, easily recognizable sound, allowing household members inside to distinguish a legitimate visitor's knock from other less reassuring nighttime noises. A small practical innovation born directly out of the same nightly uncertainty, this story is traced from its very beginning. Some wealthier households maintained an entirely separate bell or knocker, reserved specifically for late-night use, connected directly to a servant's sleeping quarters rather than the household's main entrance, allowing a genuine emergency to be distinguished quickly from an ordinary daytime caller without disturbing the entire sleeping household unnecessarily. One particularly striking example of this architectural adaptation survives in the older quarters of Edinburgh, where narrow, densely packed stone stairways still visible today behind unassuming street entrances once served entire vertical communities of households stacked one above another. These shared entryways were typically fitted with a substantial gate or door at street level, closed and secured each night by mutual arrangement among the residents living above, transforming what might otherwise have been dozens of individually vulnerable doorways into a single collectively defended point of entry. It is a small practical detail, easy to walk past without a second thought if you did not already know its purpose, and yet it represents precisely the kind of quiet architectural compromise an entire society reaches after generations of living with the same recurring nighttime fear this story has traced from its very first moments. Family life organized itself around this same caution in ways considerably more intimate than any law or building design. Evening routines across pre-industrial households, regardless of wealth or region, tended to follow a remarkably consistent shape: closing shutters, banking the fire, checking locks, and gathering the household together in whatever single room offered the most warmth and the least exposure to the street well before true darkness fully settled in. This gathering carried practical value beyond simple caution, conserving the household's limited supply of candlelight by concentrating everyone in one space rather than scattering flames across several rooms, but it also served a quieter emotional function worth naming: honestly. Sitting together, sharing a small circle of firelight while the rest of the world outside went dark and uncertain, offered its own kind of reassurance, a nightly ritual of closeness that many households maintained for reasons that were only partly practical. This nightly gathering followed its own quiet, largely unwritten choreography, repeated with remarkable consistency across households of considerably different means and circumstances. The household head, or whoever held that particular authority within a given family, typically oversaw the final round of securing the home, personally checking each shutter and door with his or her own hands, rather than simply trusting the task to a servant or child. A small but meaningful ritual of responsibility that surviving diaries and letters describe with a consistency, suggesting it carried real emotional weight beyond its purely practical function. Prayers where a household practiced them were frequently timed specifically to this closing ritual, offered aloud once the home had been fully secured, a verbal punctuation mark closing out the vulnerable transition between the activity of daylight and the enforced stillness of night. Children old enough to understand the ritual are recorded in more than one surviving personal account, treating the sound of the final bolt sliding into place with genuine palpable relief, a small domestic echo of the exact same relief an entire walled city might feel once its own gates have been secured for the evening. Servants and apprentices living within a household occupied a particular, often overlooked position within this same nightly ritual, frequently responsible for the actual physical labour of closing shutters, banking fires, and checking locks on behalf of the family they served. Work performed in the final fading light, or more often by touch and long familiarity once true darkness had already settled in. Household manuals and instructional texts surviving from this era devote surprising attention to exactly this responsibility, offering detailed guidance on the correct order and thoroughness with which a servant should complete the evening's securing tasks. Evidence of just how seriously an ordinary household treated this daily transition, worthy in the eyes of contemporary writers of formal written instruction rather than simple casual habit. It is within exactly this nightly gathering that one of the more genuinely touching consequences of this long history took shape: the tradition of storytelling as a specifically nighttime activity. Across an enormous range of cultures and centuries, the hours immediately following the closing of shutters and the banking of the fire became strongly associated with oral storytelling. Parents and grandparents passing down folk tales, cautionary stories, and family history to children gathered close around whatever light remained. Some of the very stories preserved through this tradition, scholars studying folklore have long noted, directly reflect the nighttime anxieties this story has traced throughout. Tales warning children about wandering too far from home after dark, about strangers encountered on lonely roads, about the specific dangers waiting just beyond the edge of the firelight. The bedtime story, in other words, considered simply as a beloved and comforting tradition today, likely traces at least part of its origin to something considerably more practical: a society using its captive nighttime audience to pass along generation after generation exactly the kind of caution that had kept their own ancestors alive. Even sleeping arrangements themselves reflect this same accumulated caution in ways that might surprise a modern reader accustomed to considerably more privacy after dark. Sharing a bed, and often an entire room, among multiple family members or even unrelated household members such as servants and apprentices was standard practice across most of pre-industrial Europe, driven partly by simple economic necessity, but reinforced in no small part by a genuine and rarely stated preference for the safety that shared sleeping space provided. A household member sleeping alone in a separate room was, in a very literal sense, more vulnerable to an intruder than one surrounded by others who might call out or physically resist should anything disturb the household during the night. Historians studying household inventories and personal accounts from this era note that even wealthier families, who could easily have afforded separate sleeping quarters for every member of the household, frequently chose not to arrange things that way, at least not entirely, suggesting that comfort and social custom alone do not fully explain the pattern, and that an inherited, largely unspoken awareness of nighttime vulnerability likely played its own quiet role in how these households organized their most private hours. The language itself absorbed traces of this long history, though tracing the exact origin of any single surviving phrase requires real caution, since popular explanations for old idioms are notoriously prone to confident claims that later research fails to fully support. The phrase describing the deepest, most dangerous hour of the night as something close to a witching hour survives in common use. Even now, a linguistic fossil of exactly the fears this story has traced through witch trials, mob violence, and centuries of civic ordnance. Other phrases connected to nighttime labor and nighttime danger drifted into modern usage, carrying only a faint half-remembered echo of their original context, familiar enough to use casually without most speakers ever pausing to wonder where the association between darkness and danger, so deeply embedded in the phrase itself, actually came from. Medicine and healing practice absorb their own quiet layer of this same accumulated caution in ways that reveal just how thoroughly nighttime anxiety had woven itself into even the most practical corners of daily life. Physicians and midwives across this era developed specific protocols for nighttime emergencies distinct from their daytime practice, often maintaining a household member or apprentice specifically responsible for waking them should an urgent nighttime summons arrive. Since a household in genuine medical distress after dark faced not only the underlying emergency itself, but the considerable additional risk of sending a messenger out into exactly the kind of darkness this entire story has spent so long describing. Some surviving medical account books from this era record explicitly higher fees charged for nighttime attendance, a small but telling piece of evidence that even skilled professionals whose entire vocation was built around helping others recognized and were compensated for the genuine additional risk and difficulty involved in practicing their trade after the sun had gone down. What ties all of these consequences together? The legal distinction, the architectural adaptation, the family ritual. The surviving language is a single quietly remarkable pattern worth naming. Plainly, before this story moves any further forward, an entire civilization across many centuries and many different regions absorbed a single recurring fear so completely that it reshaped nearly every visible layer of ordinary existence. From the precise wording of criminal statutes down to the shape of a window and the bedtime ritual of a small child listening to a grandmother's cautionary tale. Few single fears in human history can claim quite this thorough and lasting an imprint on the ordinary texture of daily life, and fewer still have left behind quite so many small still visible traces for anyone willing to look closely enough to notice them. It is worth sitting for just a moment with how strange this actually is, considered all at once. A fear born from wolves, thieves, and unlit roads eventually reshape the precise legal definition of a crime. The height of a window, the design of a door hinge, the timing of a bedtime story, and the fee, a physician charged for an emergency visit. No single authority planned any of this deliberately as a unified system. It accumulated instead, household by household, city by city, generation by generation, each small adaptation responding sensibly to the same recurring problem without any individual actor fully grasping the scale of the pattern they were quietly contributing to. That is in its own way one of the more remarkable qualities of a fear this old and this widely shared. It does not need coordination to reshape a civilization. It only needs enough time and enough people independently arriving at the same quiet, sensible precautions. Not every one of these traces has vanished along with the fear that originally produced it. Some of them, in altered and largely unrecognized form, persisted stubbornly into the modern world. This story is about to arrive in plain sight within buildings, habits and language that most people today would never think to connect back to a curfew bell ringing across a darkened medieval street. Following those surviving threads forward into the world we actually live in now is where this story turns next. Walk down almost any street in a modern city after dark and you are standing, whether you realize it or not, at the far end of a story that began with a single tallow candle guttering in a pre-industrial window. The lanterns this story followed through their earliest uncertain years in Paris and Amsterdam did not remain oil flames flickering behind hornpanes forever. They kept evolving generation after generation, technology quietly answering the same old fear with steadily improving tools, until the night itself, at least in much of the modern world, stopped resembling anything the people in this story would have recognized as truly dark at all. The next major leap arrived roughly a century and a half after those first systematic lantern networks, when an entirely new fuel source promised something the old oil lamps never quite managed: Genuinely bright, genuinely reliable illumination, capable of extending across an entire city rather than remaining confined to a scattering of individually maintained flames. In the opening years of the 1800s, a London street became the site of a demonstration that would eventually transform urban life across the entire industrialized world. Gas pipe directly beneath the pavement and burned in specially designed street lamps, producing a light considerably steadier and considerably brighter than anything the old oil lanterns had offered. Within a matter of decades, gas lighting spread across major cities throughout Europe and beyond, and the familiar figure of the lamplighter walking his evening rounds with a small flame held aloft simply adapted to the new fuel rather than disappearing, now igniting gas jets instead of oil wicks, along essentially the same routes his predecessors had walked for generations. Public reaction to this new gas lighting echoed in curious and almost affectionate ways the very same debates this story already traced surrounding the earliest oil lanterns more than a century before. Some observers greeted the new brightness with genuine wonder, describing streets transformed almost beyond recognition, capable of supporting evening commerce, socializing and safe travel on a scale earlier generations would have found difficult to imagine. Others voiced real anxiety, some rooted in practical concern over the safety of piping a flammable gas beneath crowded city streets, others rooted in something closer to the older, more familiar unease. This story has already explored a lingering discomfort with just how thoroughly this new brightness was erasing the last remaining pockets of genuine privacy that darkness had always offered. Newspaper accounts from this era record both reactions playing out side by side, sometimes within the very same article. Wonder and wariness intertwined in a way that feels on reflection entirely consistent with everything this story has already shown about how complicated humanity's relationship with its own darkness has always been. Electric lighting arrived close behind, and its adoption, once it genuinely took hold, proceeded with the speed that must have felt almost dizzying to anyone old enough to remember the deeply uneven patchwork lighting systems this story described in earlier chapters. Arc lamps producing an intensely bright, somewhat harsh light appeared first in scattered installations before giving way to the gentler, more practical incandescent bulb. And by the early decades of the 1900s, entire cities across the industrialized world had begun converting their street lighting systems to electricity, a transformation that occurred in historical terms astonishingly quickly compared to the centuries it had taken simply to establish reliable oil lighting in the first place. The lamplighter, that quiet, familiar figure who had walked the evening streets for well over 2 centuries, by this point finally began disappearing from most major cities during this era, his nightly ritual rendered unnecessary by centralized electrical systems that could illuminate an entire street with the simple closing of a switch, requiring no human hand to carry the flame from lamp to lamp any longer. A small number of these lamplighters do still exist today in a handful of cities that have deliberately preserved gas lighting in certain historic districts for the sake of atmosphere and tradition, rather than practical necessity. Their evening rounds now serve a purpose almost entirely reversed from the original one. No longer a genuine defense against darkness, but a small cherished piece of living history, maintained specifically because visitors and residents alike have come to value the warmth and character of that old flickering light, even in an age when far brighter, far more efficient alternatives are readily available just a few streets away. It is a fitting, quietly moving detail to sit with a profession born entirely out of fear now surviving in its last remaining pockets purely out of affection. It would be a mistake, though, to read this final technological triumph as the complete and total end of the story. This video has spent so long tracing because the underlying human fear that drove every single one of these innovations did not simply vanish once the streets grew bright enough to see by. It changed shape instead, migrating from a genuine, statistically justified concern about wolves, robbers, and unlit roads into something considerably more diffuse, more psychological, and in its own way just as persistent. Modern researchers studying fear of darkness have found that the underlying unease many people still report feeling in unfamiliar dark spaces appears to draw on something considerably older than any specific memory or personal experience, an inherited, largely unconscious wariness that may reflect very deep evolutionary programming, rather than any purely rational assessment of actual modern risk. Children, notably, tend to develop a fear of darkness at a strikingly consistent age across widely different cultures and environments, regardless of whether their own particular modern neighborhood carries any genuine elevated nighttime danger at all, a pattern that researchers studying childhood development have connected to broader theories about inherited caution around reduced visibility, dating back considerably further than any of the specific historical fears this story has traced through medieval curfews and early modern witch trials. The modern night light, that small unremarkable glow so common in children's bedrooms across much of the world today, represents its own quiet, direct descendant of everything this story has already covered, though few parents plugging one into a wall socket likely think of it that way, where a pre-industrial household relied on a shared bed, a banked fire, and the reassuring presence of other sleeping family members to ease a child's nighttime fear. A modern household increasingly relies instead on a small, deliberately maintained point of artificial light kept burning through the night, specifically to hold back exactly the same instinctive unease. This story has followed across so many centuries. Child psychologists studying this fear generally treat it as a normal expected stage of development rather than any cause for particular concern. Further evidence that this particular anxiety runs considerably deeper than any specific cultural moment or historical circumstance surfacing reliably in each new generation, regardless of how genuinely safe that generation's actual nighttime environment happens to be. There is a genuinely interesting piece of modern research worth pausing on here, because it suggests the old historical association between darkness and danger has not simply persisted as vague cultural residue, but continues shaping measurable real-world behavior even now. Urban planners and architects working through the middle and later decades of the 20th century began paying close, deliberate attention to how lighting design affects a person's felt sense of safety while moving through a city after dark, developing an entire field of practical study around exactly the kind of question that this story has been circling from its opening moments. One particularly influential line of thinking developed by an urban theorist studying city streets in the mid-20th century argued that genuine safety after dark depended less on the sheer quantity of light itself and more on the presence of what she termed natural surveillance, ordinary people going about ordinary evening activity visible from windows and doorways, creating a web of informal mutual watchfulness. Not entirely unlike the very earliest neighbourhood watch systems, this story traced back to medieval England, though built now on architecture and urban design rather than sworn civic duty and a curfew bell. This same insight eventually formalised into a broader design discipline sometimes referred to by planners and architects as crime prevention through environmental design. A framework built around the practical observation that how a space is lit, arranged, and overlooked by the surrounding buildings meaningfully affects both actual crime rates and, just as importantly, how safe ordinary people feel while moving through that space after dark. Modern crime statistics, gathered with the precision and consistency this story's earlier centuries could never have managed, continue to confirm something the coroner's rolls and court transcripts of pre-industrial Europe had already suggested in their own scattered, imperfect way, that certain categories of crime still cluster disproportionately in the hours after dark, even in cities blazing with electric light around the clock. Criminologists studying this modern pattern debate exactly how much of it reflects genuine opportunity created by the reduced visibility, as opposed to simple differences in who tends to be out and moving during those same hours, an argument that echoes almost precisely the same methodological uncertainty historians studying the pre-industrial record wrestled with earlier in this story. This same modern research has produced its own genuinely surprising complication, one worth sitting with honestly rather than smoothing over. Simply adding more artificial light to a given street does not on its own reliably reduce crime the way earlier generations of planners sometimes assumed it would. Some studies suggest brighter lighting mainly shifts the felt sense of safety among residents, encouraging more people to walk, gather, and remain visible outdoors after dark, which in turn produces exactly the kind of natural surveillance this story described earlier, while other research finds that additional lighting alone, without accompanying changes in how a space is actually used and overlooked by others, produces surprisingly modest measurable reductions in crime by itself. The evidence remains genuinely mixed on this specific question, and urban planners continue debating how to weigh raw illumination against the more complicated, harder-to-engineer factor of genuine community presence and mutual visibility, a debate that in its own way echoes the very first lesson this story offered about the night watch centuries ago, that presence, visibility, and a sense of shared responsibility mattered every bit as much as any single technological fix. There is a curious, almost poetic reversal buried within this long arc of technological progress, one this story would be incomplete without acknowledging honestly. After centuries of relentless effort to push back the darkness, installing ever brighter lanterns, ever more reliable street lamps, ever more comprehensive electrical grids, a genuinely new movement has emerged in recent decades arguing for exactly the opposite priority in certain contexts, deliberately reducing artificial light rather than expanding it further. Astronomers and environmental scientists have documented growing concern over what researchers now call light pollution, the accumulated brightness of modern artificial lighting that has in many populated regions made it genuinely difficult or impossible to see more than a handful of stars on even the clearest night, a stark contrast to the uninterrupted, star-filled darkness that would have been entirely ordinary and unremarkable to every single person this story has followed across its earlier centuries. Communities in various parts of the world have begun actively working to preserve or restore genuine nighttime darkness in specific protected areas, designating what are sometimes called dark sky reserves, adjusting lighting fixtures and municipal ordinances specifically to allow the natural night sky to remain visible overhead. A genuinely striking historical irony given everything this story has already traced about how desperately earlier generations fought to eliminate that same darkness from their own streets. These modern dark sky initiatives involve a surprisingly detailed set of practical adjustments, considerably more thoughtful than simply switching off a few streetlights. Specially designed fixtures direct light downward toward the ground where it is actually needed, rather than scattering it upward and outward into the sky, where it serves no practical purpose beyond washing out the stars overhead. Certain communities have adopted specific curfews of their own, though inverted entirely from the ones this story spent so long describing, requiring outdoor lighting to dim or switch off after a certain hour, rather than requiring citizens to stay indoors once darkness falls. It is a striking, almost dizzying inversion to sit with an ordinance restricting light rather than restricting movement, born from a conviction that darkness itself, properly understood and carefully managed, has genuine value worth actively protecting rather than simply enduring or eliminating. Migratory birds, sea turtle, hatchlings, and numerous other species that rely on natural darkness for navigation and survival have become part of the practical justification for these modern efforts as well. Adding an ecological dimension to this reversal that would have been entirely unfamiliar to any of the officials and ordinary citizens, this story has followed through so many earlier centuries of fighting the dark rather than protecting it. This modern reversal complicates any simple, tidy narrative in which increasing light straightforwardly represents unambiguous human progress, and it is worth pausing to consider what that complication actually reveals. The fear this story has followed across so many centuries was never really about darkness itself, considered as some abstract, universal enemy. It was about the specific, genuine dangers that darkness concealed within crowded, poorly governed, imperfectly lit human settlements. Wolves along unmarked roads, thieves exploiting unwatched streets, accusations built on testimony no one could properly verify. Once those specific historical conditions changed, once cities developed reliable lighting, organized policing, and genuine legal accountability, that did not depend on whether the sun happened to be up, the underlying darkness itself, considered simply as an absence of light, rather than a specific set of dangers, revealed itself to hold its own genuine value after all. For astronomy, for certain fragile ecosystems that depend on natural night cycles, and for the simple, quiet human wonder of actually being able to look up and see the same star-filled sky that once stretched entirely uninterrupted over every single person and every single fear this story has traced from its very first moments. None of this means the old instinctive unease has disappeared entirely, even in the most brightly lit modern city. Ask almost any person walking alone down an unfamiliar, poorly lit street after dark, even today, even in a country with functioning police, reliable emergency services, and streetlights on nearly every corner, and you will likely hear an honest description of at least some lingering wariness, a quickened pace, a heightened attention to footsteps behind them, an instinct that modern circumstances have made statistically less necessary in most places than it once genuinely was, and yet an instinct that clearly has not simply evaporated along with the specific historical dangers that originally produced it. Scholars who study the psychology of fear continue to debate exactly how much of this persistent modern unease reflects a genuine evolved caution worth respecting on its own terms, as opposed to a kind of cultural inheritance. Absorbed through centuries of story warning and folklore, this video is traced in such careful detail, passed down long after the specific conditions that first justified it have meaningfully changed. There may be real wisdom in refusing to fully resolve that particular debate, at least for now. A wariness this deeply rooted, surviving intact across so many centuries of changing technology, changing law and changing circumstance, likely serves some genuine ongoing purpose even in a world where the original wolves, thieves, and unlit roads no longer pose quite the same statistical threat they once did. Caution, after all, costs relatively little to carry and can save a great deal when it happens to be needed, and an instinct this old and this widely shared across so many different cultures and centuries may simply be doing exactly what it always did, keeping people just alert enough, just careful enough to navigate whatever uncertainty the dark still genuinely holds even now, even in a city glowing with electric light from one end to the other. What seems clear, regardless of exactly how that particular scholarly debate eventually resolves, is that this story never really ended in any final tidy sense. It simply changed form again and again the way any sufficiently old and deeply rooted human fear tends to do, moving from wolves to witches to unlit alleys to the electric hum of a modern streetlight, and now in certain quiet, deliberate corners of the modern world, back toward a genuine appreciation for exactly the kind of darkness earlier generations spent centuries trying desperately to escape. The night, it turns out, was never simply the enemy. This entire story might have suggested in its earliest chapters. It was something considerably more complicated, dangerous in specific, documented, historically real ways, and yet also all along holding within it something worth eventually learning to see again. That fuller, more complete picture, the danger and the wonder both held honestly together at once, deserves one final quiet look before this long story comes to its own close. Back where it began on an ordinary dark street with an ordinary person simply trying to get home. Turn for a moment to that narrow street where this story first found its footing hours and centuries ago now. A young apprentice walking faster than he meant to, one hand pressed against cold stone, counting turns toward a home he suddenly could not picture clearly enough. He never had a name in this telling, and that was deliberate. He could have been almost anyone in almost any century moving through almost any city this story has since walked through together, had is in the end. The real subject this entire journey has been circling. Not one apprentice, not one city, not one century, but an entire enormous, largely anonymous population of ordinary people who simply had to get home once the light went out, generation after generation for the better part of human history. It's been a long walk to get back to him, and it is worth pausing briefly to look back over the whole shape of that walk before letting him go. This story began in a world ruled entirely by the sun, where a household's evening ended the moment its single candle burned down, where wolves still moved through the countryside and open wells waited in the dark for a careless footstep. It moved through the earliest clumsy attempts to answer that darkness. A bell borrowed from the simple act of covering a fire, a tithing group bound together by shared responsibility, a hue and cry that could turn an entire sleeping street into a pursuit within seconds. It walked through the height of that control gates locked on schedule, lanterns required by law, passwords guarded like military secrets, an entire population learning to live inside a curfew that reached into nearly every corner of ordinary life. It watched that same system strain and crack under its own weight, mocked watchmen, bribed officials, criminals who learned the tangled streets better than anyone paid to police them. It witnessed the turn toward light itself, one stubborn official in Paris, one inventive painter in Amsterdam, both reaching for the same idea within a few years of each other, neither fully aware of the other's work. And it did not look away from the darkest chapter of all the accusations, the mob violence, the deaths that close without answers, because a story that only shows the lanterns and never the shadows they were built to hold back would not have been telling the truth. From there, this story turned to the evidence itself, the coroner's rolls and court transcripts and watch logs that let us hear faintly the actual voices of people describing what they had seen or feared they had seen in the dark. It sat with the historians who still argue over what all of that evidence really means, an argument this story has tried to treat as a strength rather than a flaw, since honest disagreement over incomplete evidence is very often what real historical care actually looks like. It traced the consequences that outlive the fear itself, a law that still distinguishes night from day, a window built deliberately small, a bedtime story that once carried a genuine warning inside its comfort. And it followed the light forward gas to electricity to a modern world so thoroughly illuminated that some communities are now strangely and rather beautifully working to bring a little of the old darkness back, not out of fear this time, but out of wonder. Consider everything that population built out of nothing more than fear and stubbornness and the simple refusal to accept that darkness could not be answered. A curfew bell borrowed from the humble act of covering a household fire growing into an entire civic ritual observed across a continent. A night watch, imperfect, underpaid, often mocked, and yet present night after night, offering exactly the kind of reassurance that a voice calling out the hour in the dark seems to have meant more to people than any of us. Safe now in our brightly lit rooms can easily imagine. A lantern first hung outside a single door in London, then strung by the thousand across the streets of Paris, then reinvented by a painter in Amsterdam, who also happened to design fire hoses, because it turns out the same curious practical mind can hold both problems at once. A profession, the lamplighter, born entirely out of necessity and surviving in its last remaining pockets purely out of affection, which might be one of the gentlest transformations any human fear has ever undergone. And running alongside all of that genuine patient effort, the story this video has never tried to soften or look away from. Accusations built on nothing more than a shadow glimpsed at the wrong hour. Trials that could not be answered because darkness itself had erased any possible alibi. A bell in Paris, the very same kind of bell that once called a city to prayer and curfew and safety, repurposed in a single terrible summer to signal the opposite of everything it had ever meant. Mobs who understood with grim practical clarity that the night offered exactly the anonymity that daylight never could. Coroners writing careful, incomplete entries about travellers who simply never arrived, closing each file with the same honest, unsatisfying admission that the night had kept its secrets and no one left behind could pry them loose. Both of these truths sit comfortably together once you understand where each one comes from, and holding them together, rather than choosing one over the other, is probably the most honest way to carry this story forward into the quiet close it has been walking toward from its very first sentence. Think for a moment about survival itself, since that is really what this entire story has been describing from every possible angle. Not survival in any single dramatic sense. Not one battle or one dramatic escape, but the far quieter, far more common kind, the kind practiced every single evening by an ordinary household, closing its shutters, banking its fire, gathering its children close and simply making it through to morning one more time. Multiply that small, unremarkable act by every household in every town across every single night of many hundreds of years, and you begin to sense the true scale of what this story has actually been describing all along. Civilizations are not only built in daylight in the visible work of kings and armies and grand construction, they are built just as surely in the dark in the accumulated weight of millions of ordinary nights survive one after another, by people whose names left almost no trace in any surviving record at all. Collapse runs through this same story too, though, never in the way a more dramatic telling might have shaped it. Empires this story never had reason to name rose and fell across these same centuries. Kings who once seemed permanent were forgotten within a generation or two of their own deaths, and yet the curfew bell rang on largely indifferent to whichever crown happened to be issuing the ordinance behind it. The watch walked its rounds through the reigns of rulers whose names have long since faded from ordinary memory. There is something quietly humbling in that pattern, worth sitting with honestly. The grand, visible structures of power that history usually chooses to remember, the thrones and the treaties and the wars, proved considerably more fragile in the end than the modest, unglamorous machinery of an ordinary night watch, passed quietly from one generation of tired, underpaid citizens to the next, largely unconcerned with whoever happened to be ruling above them. Memory itself, the very thing this story has depended on to exist at all, turns out to be its own fragile, remarkable survivor. A parish clerk's careful handwriting entered into a ledger centuries ago with no expectation that anyone beyond the next magistrate would ever read it. A court transcript preserved not out of any grand historical intention, but simple bureaucratic habit. A single surviving lantern kept behind glass in a small museum collection, its purpose nearly forgotten by most of the people who walk past it. None of this was built to last. All of it did against considerable odds long enough for this story to eventually find it, piece it together and carry it forward to you, lying somewhere tonight, listening to the end of a fear that shaped the ordinary lives of untold millions of people who never once imagined anyone centuries later would still be thinking about them at all. It is worth honouring too everything this story could not fully answer along the way. Whether the fear of night was earned by genuine danger or amplified by centuries of inherited warning, whether segmented sleep reflected true biology or simple practical necessity. Whether one city or another truly deserves credit for the first lantern ever hung with real systematic intention. Historians will likely keep arguing over each of these questions for as long as anyone continues asking them, and that ongoing, careful uncertainty is not a weakness in this story. It is, if anything, a kind of honesty this particular channel has tried to hold onto from its very first sentence tonight. The honesty of admitting that the past, however thoroughly researched, however patiently pieced together from ledgers and transcripts and surviving lanterns, will never fully surrender every one of its secrets. Some of what happened on those countless dark nights simply belongs now and forever to the people who lived through it and to no one else. And running through every single layer of this story underneath the bells and the lanterns and the trials and the debates sits the quiet, stubborn resilience of entirely ordinary people. Not heroes in any grand sense this story has ever tried to claim for them. A baker taking his unwilling turn on watch duty. A servant closing shutters by rote in the last light of evening. A grandmother passing down a cautionary tale by firelight, half warning and half unable to fully separate the two. A clerk writing down what little could be established about a death no one would ever solve simply because the writing itself seemed to matter. None of these people set out to build anything as large as the story this video has just spent hours telling. They were simply trying, each in their own small way, on their own small ordinary evening, to get everyone they loved safely through until morning. That they succeeded generation after generation, often enough for an entire civilization to eventually walk itself out of the deepest of this particular darkness, may be the most quietly remarkable achievement this story has to offer. That resilience was never distributed evenly, and this story has tried throughout not to pretend otherwise. The women who bore an extra unfair weight of suspicion simply for moving through the dark alone. The servants and labourers whose late nighttime errands carried real risk with almost none of the legal recourse available to their wealthier neighbours. The midwives called out at every hour without exception, who walked toward danger specifically because someone else's greatest need happened to fall in the middle of the night. The falsely accused whose only real crime was being poor or old or alone, or simply unlucky enough to be remembered by a frightened neighbour as having been somewhere strange after dark. Their resilience looked different from the confident, well-lit courage this story might have offered. In a simpler telling, it looked like getting up the next evening and doing it again anyway with no other real choice available, carrying a burden. This story has tried to name honestly rather than smooth over for the sake of a tidier ending. It looked like a servant girl walking the same dangerous route home night after night because the work itself could not simply stop, and like a woman living alone who kept her lamp lit a little longer than she needed to, not because it changed the odds very much, but because it was the one small thing entirely within her own control. History rarely writes their names down. This story could not give them back either, but it could at least refuse to let their particular weight go entirely unspoken one final time before the telling comes to its own close. There is a kind of fragility running underneath everything this story has traced worth naming plainly here at the end. Every single system that this video has described, the watch, the curfew, the lantern network, the entire elaborate machinery built to hold back the dark, was ultimately just an arrangement among ordinary, tired, imperfect people agreeing imperfectly and incompletely to look out for one another. It was never as solid as the stone gates and iron locks might have suggested. It bent under corruption. It buckled under the sheer growing scale of a changing world. It occasionally turned its own tools against the very people it was meant to protect, and yet somehow across all of that fragility, across all of those genuine failures, enough of it held generation after generation that an entire civilization eventually managed to walk itself slowly and unevenly out of total darkness and into something considerably brighter. Power itself, watched closely across this long span of centuries, turns out to be considerably more fragile than it ever looked from the inside of any single dark night. A king's authority could vanish within a generation. A city's carefully built watch system could collapse under its own corruption within a few troubled decades. Even the darkness itself, that oldest and most seemingly permanent of all adversaries, eventually gave real ground to nothing more powerful than persistence. A lantern. Here an ordinance, there one stubborn official, and one curious painter. Neither of them commanding an army, both of them managing eventually to change how an entire continent experienced its own nights. If there is a single quiet lesson buried inside everything this story has traced, it may be this. The things that feel most permanent, a fear, a form of power, a darkness that has always simply been there, are very often far less permanent than they appear from the inside of any single ordinary evening. There is one final piece of evidence worth sitting with before this story lets the night finally settle. In a small museum collection in one of the cities this story has walked through, more than once a single surviving watchman's lantern rests behind glass, its horn panes yellowed and cracked, its iron frame worn soft at the edges, by hands that held it centuries ago on a walk this story has tried in its own way to help you imagine. The candle it once carried is long gone. The man who carried it is entirely unknown, his name lost the way most ordinary names from this era simply were. What remains is only the frame itself, empty now, no longer holding back anything at all, and yet still recognizably, unmistakably built for exactly one purpose: to carry a small, stubborn point of light through a world that had once been entirely uniformly dark. It is such a small object to have survived so much, and it is in its own quiet way everything this story has been trying to say. The night across all of this long-layered history was never simply the villain a simpler telling might have made it out to be. It was a mirror instead, showing back whatever a given society happened to bring into it. Fear became cruelty in certain places in certain terrible years. Fear became astonishing patient cooperation in far more places, far more often ordinary people quietly agreeing night after night to stand a small watch on one another's behalf. The darkness itself never changed at all, not really, not across the entire span of this story. It was always simply an absence of light. What changed slowly and unevenly and at real human cost was what people did inside it. Somewhere tonight, in a city very far from any of the ones this story has walked through, a streetlight is quietly holding back exactly the same darkness that Apprentice once hurried through so many centuries ago. Most people walking beneath it will never think of him at all, and there is no reason they should. That in the end may be the quietest, truest measure of how far this particular story has actually travelled. The fear that once organised entire civilizations has become, for many people, now simply background, unremarkable, barely worth a second thought on an ordinary evening walk. That is not nothing. That is centuries of accumulated human effort wearing itself down into something so ordinary it has become almost invisible. It is worth letting that settle gently before the story closes. So much of what this story has traced has already faded. The bells no longer ring at dusk. The gates no longer close. Most of the watchmen's names were never written down at all. And still something remains. The light does not remember the fear that built it. It simply shines. There is a kind of grace in that. A fear this old carried this far by this many hands finally setting itself down. Not because the world became perfectly safe. It never quite does. But because enough people across enough centuries decided the dark was worth answering anyway. Quietly, imperfectly, night after night after night. And somewhere still an old habit remains small and almost forgotten. A lamp left burning by a door, a candle by a bed, a single warm window glowing in an otherwise dark street. We do not always know why we still do it. We simply do. Perhaps that is the oldest inheritance of all, older than any curfew bell, older than any law. A small flame kept alight for no reason anyone can fully explain anymore. Just in case, just to be sure. Somewhere tonight a door is quietly checked twice by a hand that barely notices it is doing so. Somewhere a child falls asleep beside a small glowing light, certain without knowing why that it's keeping something at bay. Somewhere an old iron lantern still hangs above a doorway unlit now for 100 years, kept anyway because some things simply feel wrong to take down. None of it is needed the way it once was. All of it is still somehow there. That is what long fear leaves behind once the danger itself has finally passed. Not panic, not memory even most of the time, just habit. Soft, quiet, inherited habit worn smooth by centuries of hands doing the same small thing for reasons none of them fully remember anymore. Somewhere a window is still lit, somewhere someone is still watching, and the night as it always has quietly passes,